Imagine a city that does not yet exist. The year is approximately 285 BC. The Macedonian general who built it, who chose the site, laid out the grid, stole the body of Alexander the Great to anchor its legitimacy, invited the scholars and the merchants and the priests, has just abdicated the throne he spent 40 years building, handing it to his son while he still breathes, still walks the palace corridors, still watches the sun rise over the harbour he made into the most important port in the ancient Mediterranean world. He has a few years left. His son has a reign of almost 4 decades ahead. And this city on the narrow coastal strip between Lake Mareotis and the sea, this city at the junction of the Nile Valley and the Mediterranean world, this city that everyone can already see is going to be something extraordinary, is still mostly a construction site. The lighthouse is not finished. The library is a founding vision rather than a functioning institution. The harbour installations are still being built. The street grid is laid, the neighbourhoods are filling, the population is growing. Already, by some estimates, one of the largest cities in the world. But the specific monuments that will define it for the next 1,000 years are either unbuilt or barely begun. Within the next 4 decades, all of this will change. The Pharos lighthouse will rise from its island in the harbour to a height that ancient sources place at somewhere between 130 and 160 metres, taller than any structure in the ancient world except the Great Pyramid at Giza, visible to ships 40 kilometres out to sea, burning its fire continuously through the night to guide the maritime traffic of the Eastern Mediterranean into the most important commercial port of the age. It will be counted, within a generation of its completion, among the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The Library of Alexandria will grow from its founding vision into the most ambitious intellectual institution in the history of human civilization, a collection, by the most credible ancient estimates, of somewhere between 400,000 and 700,000 book rolls, the accumulated texts of every significant tradition in the known world, presided over by scholar librarians of the caliber of Callimachus, Eratosthenes, and Apollonius of Rhodes, whose work will shape the intellectual development of the ancient world for the next 5 centuries, and whose influence will reach, through the chain of transmission that Alexandria established, all the way to the present. The museum, the institution dedicated to the muses, the sanctuary within which the scholars worked, argued, ate their meals, conducted their researches, and produced the work that made Alexandria the intellectual centre of the Hellenistic world, will become the first institution in the ancient world that looks, in its organisation and its ambitions, like a university. The ruler who built all of this, who took the founding vision of his father, Ptolemy I Soter, and realised it at a scale and with a completeness that transformed a Macedonian general's strategic gambit into one of the most consequential civilizations in the history of the ancient world, was Ptolemy II, called Philadelphus, the brother lover. He ruled Egypt for 38 years, from the beginning of his co-regency with his father in 285 BC to his death in 246 BC. He did not lead armies on dramatic campaigns. He did not produce the kind of battlefield glory that ancient historians preferred to record. He governed with extraordinary intelligence, extraordinary patience, and an extraordinary commitment to the specific vision of Egypt as the most commercially productive, most diplomatically sophisticated, and most intellectually active kingdom in the Hellenistic world. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand not just who Ptolemy II was, but what his reign produced, what the specific combination of his personal qualities, his administrative intelligence, his cultural investment, and his extraordinarily favourable circumstances built in 40 years of sustained creative effort at the most important intersection of civilizations the ancient world had ever produced. Let that sink in. 1 man, 40 years. The Library of Alexandria, the Pharos Lighthouse, the most comprehensive zoological collection in the ancient world, the first systematic translation of the Hebrew scriptures into Greek, a trading empire that stretched from the Aegean to the Red Sea, a diplomatic network that reached Rome, India, and the kingdoms of sub-Saharan Africa, a cultural synthesis so precise and so productive that it made Alexandria the city that every educated person in the ancient Mediterranean world aspired to visit, to study in, and to be shaped by. This is not a minor reign. This is one of the most consequential periods of civilizational construction in the history of the ancient world. Before we get started, if you find these stories as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now, let's begin. The silence around Ptolemy II in the popular imagination of the ancient world is proportionate to none of this. He is overshadowed by his father the general, by his final descendant Cleopatra, by the dramatic military campaigns of the other Hellenistic rulers, whose battlefield achievements generated the kind of narrative that ancient historians preferred to record. He built, he governed, he commissioned, he funded, and in the specific way that builders and governors and commissioners and funders tend to be forgotten in favor of the men who conquered the territories they had the wisdom to develop. He has been left largely in the shadows of the dynasty he, more than anyone else, transformed from a military inheritance into a genuine civilization. The shadows are ending now. This is the full story of Ptolemy II Philadelphus, the builder of Alexandria's wonders, the patron of its scholars, the architect of its commercial empire, and the man whose 40-year reign turned a founding vision into one of the most extraordinary civilizational achievements in the history of the ancient world. To understand what Ptolemy II built, you need to understand what he was given, and what he was given was both more and less than it appeared. On the surface, the inheritance was extraordinary. Ptolemy I had spent 40 years building the most stable of all the successor kingdoms carved from Alexander's empire, a naturally defended territory of exceptional agricultural productivity, administered through a sophisticated dual Greek-Egyptian system that had proven capable of generating the revenue levels needed to sustain a major military and commercial power. He had established Alexandria as the capital, begun the library, cultivated the relationship with the Egyptian priesthood, and built the diplomatic and commercial networks that connected Egypt to the wider Hellenistic world. When he abdicated in favor of his son in 285 BC, the first peaceful, voluntary transfer of power in the entire history of the successor kingdoms, he handed over something genuinely remarkable: a functioning, stable, prosperous state with clear institutional structures and a founding vision that had not yet been fully realized. The less was this: Ptolemy II was not the oldest son. He was not the obvious heir. His father had, from an earlier union with a Macedonian woman named Eurydice, older sons who had better claims by traditional Macedonian succession standards. The specific circumstances by which Ptolemy II became the designated heir, the maneuvers and the family politics, and the specific interventions of his mother Berenice, who had become Ptolemy I's most favoured wife, and whose son the future Philadelphus clearly was, are documented in the ancient sources with the specific mixture of fact and gossip that Hellenistic court politics generated in abundance. What is clear is that the succession was contested, that the older half-brothers presented a threat that the new king had to manage in the early years of his reign, and that the specific methods he used to manage that threat, including the execution of at least one half-brother and the exile of others, established the character of his early rule as something rather less philosophically serene than the subsequent reputation for scholarly patronage might suggest. Ptolemy II was not simply a gentle intellectual who happened to be king. He was a ruler who secured his throne against genuine opposition, made the hard decisions that security required, and then spent the following decades building the civilization that his name is associated with. The name Philadelphus, Brother Louver, was given to him during his lifetime in association with his relationship with his sister Arsinoe II, whom he married in what was to contemporaries an extraordinary and controversial act. Sibling marriage was the ancient Egyptian royal custom, but it was deeply alien to Greek and Macedonian tradition. The marriage produced diplomatic and cultural consequences that will be examined later in this account. For now, it is enough to note that the name itself reflects the specific character of Ptolemy II's cultural politics. the deliberate reaching back into the Egyptian tradition for practices and legitimating frameworks that connected his dynasty to the 3,000-year continuity of pharaonic rule, rather than to the shorter and less deep-rooted Macedonian military tradition. The world that Ptolemy II governed was the world of the early 3rd century BC Hellenistic Mediterranean, a world that was, by the time he came to full power, settling into the more or less permanent fragmentation that the Diadochi Wars had eventually produced. The major successor kingdoms, Ptolemaic Egypt, Seleucid Asia, Macedon, were established facts of the political landscape. The era of maximalist campaigns to reunify Alexander's empire was over. What remained were the ongoing competitions for specific territories and specific commercial advantages that would define the international politics of the Hellenistic world for the next 2 centuries. The specific international competition that most shaped the early decades of Ptolemy II's reign was the ongoing conflict with the Seleucid kingdom for control of Coele Syria, the territory of modern Lebanon, Israel, and Palestine that provided whoever held it with control of the land routes connecting Egypt to the rest of the Near East, and whose ports were essential nodes in the Eastern Mediterranean commercial network. The Syrian Wars, a series of conflicts between the Ptolemaic and Seleucid kingdoms that recurred across the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, began under Ptolemy II and shaped the military and diplomatic priorities of his entire reign. But the Syrian Wars, important as they were for his strategic position, were not the most consequential activity of his reign. The most consequential activity was the sustained, systematic, extraordinarily well-funded investment in the specific monuments and institutions that made Alexandria the center of the ancient world. The scholar who has done the most comprehensive modern synthesis of the evidence for Ptolemy II's reign is the German classicist and Ptolemaic specialist Günther Holb, whose History of the Ptolemaic Empire, published in English in 2001 CE, remains the most thorough single-volume account of the period available in the field. Holb described Ptolemy II's reign as the high point of the Ptolemaic dynasty, the period when the combination of inherited foundations, personal qualities, favorable external circumstances, and the specific creative moment of the early 3rd century BC produced results that no subsequent Ptolemaic ruler was able to match. The word high point understates the case. What Ptolemy II produced in 38 years of rule was the specific historical moment when the Library of Alexandria was functioning at its greatest scope and ambition, when the Pharos lighthouse was newly built and its engineering was a marvel of the known world, when the museum was assembling the most remarkable concentration of intellectual talent in the ancient world, when the commercial networks connecting Egypt to the widest possible range of trading partners were at their most extensive, and when the specific synthesis of Greek and Egyptian civilization that the Ptolemaic dynasty represented was at its most vital and its most creative. This moment, this specific configuration of resources and talent and vision and opportunity, lasted for about a generation. It was built by a specific person, Ptolemy II, with specific qualities and specific commitments, in a specific historical context that allowed those qualities and commitments to produce specific results. Understanding what those qualities were and how they operated in the context of his reign is the core task of this account. The discovery that transformed modern understanding of this period, the discovery that allowed scholars to see beyond the literary accounts and the monumental evidence to the actual administrative and economic reality of the early Ptolemaic state, was the Zenon papyri, already discussed in the previous account of Ptolemy I. The Zenon archive dates from the reign of Ptolemy II, specifically from the 250s and 240s BC, the middle and later decades of his reign, and provides the most detailed picture available of how the Ptolemaic state actually functioned at the level of day-to-day administration. When papyrologists in the early and mid-20th century worked through the 2,000-plus documents of the Zenon archive, what they found was a state of extraordinary organizational sophistication. The agricultural management of the Fayum, the fertile depression to the west of the Nile that Ptolemy II was systematically expanding through irrigation projects into one of the most productive agricultural areas in Egypt, was documented in detail that allowed modern economic historians to reconstruct the scale and efficiency of the operation. The commercial activities of Apollonius, the finance minister whose estate manager Zenon produced the archive, showed a man managing a commercial empire of remarkable scope, trading in grain, wine, olive oil, wool, and luxury goods across the entire eastern Mediterranean, maintaining contacts in Syria, Palestine, the Aegean Islands, Greece, and Asia Minor, and generating revenues that fed directly into the financial capacity of the Ptolemaic state. The man at the center of all of this, the king who signed off on the policies, who set the priorities, who made the decisions about what to build and whom to invite and where to invest, was Ptolemy II. The Zinnan archive does not mention him constantly. He is not the subject of most of the documents, but the administrative system that the documents describe is his system, built during his reign, reflecting his priorities and his vision of what the Ptolemaic kingdom should be. What the documents show, in the aggregate, is a state that had the resources, the organizational capacity, and the governing intelligence to support the extraordinary civilizational investments that Ptolemy II made at Alexandria. The library was not a vanity project that a wealthy king could afford to indulge. It was the cultural investment that made strategic sense for a ruler who understood that Alexandria's position as the intellectual center of the Hellenistic world was a source of commercial and diplomatic power as well as cultural prestige. The scholars who came to Alexandria came because the library was there. The merchants who used Alexandria's harbour came because the city was safe, well-governed, and commercially welcoming. The rulers who engaged with Ptolemy II diplomatically engaged more carefully and more respectfully because his kingdom was demonstrably prosperous, intellectually impressive, and capable of projecting power across the eastern Mediterranean world. The library, the pharos, the museum, the commercial empire, these were not separate projects. They were aspects of a single strategy, the strategy of making Alexandria so extraordinary, so uniquely valuable, so irreplaceable in the networks of the ancient world that neither commercial partners nor military rivals could afford to ignore it or to treat it as simply one kingdom among many. Ptolemy II understood this. He built it deliberately, and the extraordinary thing is that it worked. The scale of what Ptolemy II was managing requires some specific numbers to convey, because without the numbers the achievement remains abstract. Egypt under the early Ptolemies was, by the most credible ancient estimates, generating annual state revenues of something in the range of 12,000 to 15,000 talents of silver, a talent being a weight-based unit of currency, approximately equivalent to around 26 kilograms of silver. This figure, which appears in various forms in the ancient sources, including in a famous account preserved by Appian of Alexandria, represents a level of state income that was substantially larger than that of any other Hellenistic kingdom and roughly comparable to the revenues of the Persian Empire at the height of its power, which had administered a territory perhaps 20 times the size of Ptolemaic Egypt. The math is striking. Egypt was generating the revenues of an empire from the resources of a single, relatively small territory. The efficiency was a product of three factors working together: the extraordinary natural productivity of the Nile Valley's agricultural system, the specific administrative infrastructure that the Ptolemaic state had built to convert that productivity into tax revenue with maximum efficiency, and the commercial income generated by Alexandria's position as the primary trading hub of the eastern Mediterranean. The commercial dimension is particularly important for understanding the specific character of Ptolemy II's contribution. He inherited a commercial system that his father had established: the harbour infrastructure, the Naucratis trading privileges, the connections with the Greek commercial world, and he extended it in two directions simultaneously. The first direction was northward, into the Aegean and Mediterranean world. The fleet that Ptolemy II maintained, one of the largest in the ancient world for most of his reign, was not primarily a military instrument, though it served military purposes in the Syrian wars and the other conflicts of his reign. It was primarily a commercial and diplomatic instrument. The physical capacity to protect Egyptian merchant shipping, to project Egyptian commercial presence across the eastern Mediterranean, and to guarantee the security of the trading routes on which Alexandria's prosperity depended. The combination of naval power and commercial organization that Ptolemy II built in the Aegean gave him a position of commercial dominance that the other Hellenistic kingdoms, less commercially focused and less financially sophisticated, could not easily challenge. The second direction was southward, into the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. This is the dimension of Ptolemy II's commercial expansion that is least known to popular audiences and most important for understanding the full scope of his ambition. He systematically developed the Red Sea ports that gave Egypt access to the Indian Ocean trade, Berenice, Myos Hormuz, and other harbour sites on the Egyptian Red Sea coast that became the entry points for the luxury goods, spices, incense, silk, precious stones that flowed from India and Arabia and sub-Saharan Africa into the Mediterranean world through the Ptolemaic commercial system. The development of the Red Sea trade under Ptolemy II was not simply a commercial expansion. It was a civilizational outreach of remarkable scope. Ancient sources record that Ptolemy II sent diplomatic missions to the Indian kingdom of Ashoka, the same Ashoka whose Buddhist inscriptions on stone pillars across the Indian subcontinent are among the most important surviving documents of the ancient Indian world. Ashoka's inscriptions mention receiving ambassadors from Ptolemy, a name that appears in the inscriptions as a variant of the Greek Ptolemy. The connection between the ruler of Egypt and the ruler of a large portion of India in the early 3rd century BC was a diplomatic and commercial relationship of extraordinary significance, and it was Ptolemy II who established it. The British Indologist and ancient historian John Stoneman, who has written on the ancient diplomatic connections between the Hellenistic kingdoms and India, noted that the Ptolemaic-Ashoka connection represents one of the earliest documented diplomatic relationships between the Mediterranean world and the Indian subcontinent, a connection that was commercial as well as diplomatic, and that gave Egypt a significant advantage in the luxury trade that was one of the most lucrative commercial activities of the ancient world. Simultaneously, Ptolemy II was reaching in the other direction, southward into sub-Saharan Africa. His expeditions along the African coast south of Egypt, expeditions that built on the geographical knowledge accumulated since Necho II's circumnavigation of Africa in the 6th century BC, were partly commercial, seeking the ivory, gold, and exotica of the African interior, and partly the expression of a genuine curiosity about the natural world that was characteristic of the intellectual culture of his reign. The elephant hunting expeditions that Ptolemy II organized in Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa, hunting not simply for ivory but for live elephants to be trained as war elephants, were one of the distinctive activities of his reign, and they were recorded in the Greek geographical and natural history literature of the period with the attention to specific detail that the Ptolemaic scholarly tradition cultivated. This outward reach, north into the Mediterranean, south into the Red Sea, east to India, south into Africa, defined the specific character of Alexandria under Ptolemy II. The city was not simply the capital of a kingdom, it was the hub of a world commercial system of remarkable scope, the node at which the luxury goods of Asia, the grain of Egypt, the silver of the Aegean, and the exotica of Africa all converged and were traded across a commercial network that reached further and was more systematically organized than anything the ancient world had previously produced. Understanding this commercial reality is essential for understanding the library and the museum and the other cultural institutions of Ptolemy II's reign, because those institutions were not simply cultural ornaments on a military state. They were, in their way, part of the commercial system, the cultural infrastructure of a commercial hub that needed to be not just rich and well defended, but also genuinely extraordinary, genuinely irreplaceable, genuinely worth the journey for the merchants and the ambassadors and the scholars and the travellers who came to Alexandria from every corner of the ancient world. a city that had the best library in the world, the most beautiful lighthouse in the world, the best organized harbor in the world, the most intellectually stimulating scholarly community in the world. That city was a commercial advantage in itself. Merchants who came to Alexandria for trade also came for the library, for the culture, for the specific quality of intellectual and commercial life that Ptolemy II's investment had produced. They came back. They sent their sons there to be educated. They recommended it to other merchants and other travelers. The reputation of Alexandria under Ptolemy II was itself a commercial asset, maintained and developed by the specific quality of what he built. This is the foundation from which everything else in this account grows. Not simply the patron of scholars, the architect of a civilization so precisely calibrated to its strategic environment that the cultural and the commercial and the diplomatic and the military all reinforced each other in a system of extraordinary internal coherence. Ptolemy II built that system. Now we examine how, the specific personality that drove all of this building, the inner character of Ptolemy II, to the extent that the ancient sources allow it to be glimpsed, is one of the more interesting questions in the study of the Hellenistic period, because the sources are both abundant and partial in their coverage. The most extensive ancient account of Ptolemy II as a person is provided by Athenaeus of Naucratis, writing in the late 2nd or early 3rd century CE in his Encyclopedic Deipnosophisti, a work that preserves, in the form of a lengthy dinner table conversation, an extraordinary quantity of quotations from and allusions to literary and historical works that are otherwise lost. Athenaeus was himself from Naucratis, the Greek commercial city in the Delta that had been the center of Greek-Egyptian commercial contact since the Sart period, and his knowledge of the Ptolemaic world was both extensive and distinctly Alexandrian in its perspective. What Athenaeus preserves of Ptolemy II is a picture of a ruler who combined intellectual curiosity with a taste for luxury that his contemporaries and successors found remarkable even by the standards of Hellenistic royal courts. He described elaborate banquets. He described the extraordinary pomp, the great procession that Ptolemy II organized in honor of Dionysus, a spectacular public spectacle that was one of the defining cultural events of the early 3rd century BC Hellenistic world. He described the specific objects, golden vessels, exotic animals, theatrical performances that marked Ptolemaic royal display at its most extravagant. The pomp deserves specific attention because it is one of the most significant pieces of evidence for the specific character of Ptolemy II's cultural politics. The procession, which the ancient sources describe as a stage display of extraordinary opulence and theatrical imagination, included floats depicting mythological scenes, animals from across the known world, elephants from Africa and India, ostriches, leopards, white bears, a python 18 meters long, and the systematic display of wealth in the form of golden objects and costly fabrics and precious stones on a scale designed to make an impression on every observer about the breadth of Ptolemaic commercial reach and the depth of Ptolemaic resources. This was not simply entertainment. It was political communication, a stage demonstration to the population of Alexandria and to the foreign observers who attended that the ruler of Egypt commanded resources and connections that no other kingdom in the known world could match. The exotic animals, drawn from the trading networks that reached from Africa to India, were evidence, in the most vivid possible form, of the commercial geography of Ptolemaic power. The golden objects were evidence of the financial capacity that the efficient management of Egypt's agricultural surplus had produced. The theatrical performances were evidence of the cultural sophistication that the library and the museum had generated. The pomp was, in essence, a physical demonstration of the argument that Alexandria made about itself, that it was the most extraordinary city in the world, the center of the known world's most extensive commercial network, the seat of its most sophisticated cultural life, and the home of its most powerful and most enlightened ruler. The ancient observer Calixenus of Rhodes, who recorded a detailed description of the pomp, was clearly overwhelmed by what he saw. His account, preserved by Athenaeus, is one of the most vivid descriptions of a public spectacle in all of ancient literature, and its survival reflects the degree to which the event made an impression on contemporaries that was still being discussed and described centuries later. Ptolemy II understood the value of the impression. He was not simply governing a kingdom, he was performing a civilization. The performance required specific material foundations, the commercial wealth to fund it, the administrative capacity to organize it, the diplomatic network to populate it with observers whose impressions would be communicated back to their home cities and kingdoms. But it also required a specific kind of personal engagement. The ruler who organized the pomp and the library and the pharos was not simply signing off on proposals generated by his advisors. He was, by the evidence of the ancient sources, genuinely engaged with the specific details of what was being built and how it was being presented. This personal engagement, the ruler who actually understood and cared about the cultural and intellectual projects he was sponsoring, was itself one of the most important factors in the success of the Ptolemaic cultural program. A ruler who funds scholars without understanding what they are doing will produce a less coherent and less productive scholarly community than a ruler who understands the intellectual projects and direct resources toward the most promising of them. Ptolemy II appears to have been the latter kind of patron. The specific combination of scholars he assembled at Alexandria, the specific research programs he funded, the specific institutional structures he built, reflects a patron who was making informed choices rather than simply allocating resources randomly. The result was the Library of Alexandria in its greatest period, and that result changed the world. Before moving to the specific achievements of Ptolemy II's reign, one more foundational element deserves attention: the specific political relationship that defined the character of his rule and generated the most controversial episode of his personal life: his marriage to his sister Arsinoe II. Arsinoe had been married first to Lysimachus, the powerful successor king who held Thrace and much of Asia Minor, and then to Ptolemy Ceraunus, the older half-brother whom Ptolemy II had displaced from the Egyptian succession. After a series of political adventures that read more like a Hellenistic tragedy than a diplomatic record, Arsinoe returned to Egypt, where she became her brother's queen, the first of the sibling marriages that would become a characteristic and characteristically controversial feature of Ptolemaic dynastic practice. The ancient sources treat this marriage with a mixture of scandal and political analysis. The scandal was real. Greek and Macedonian tradition found sibling marriage deeply objectionable, a violation of the basic prohibitions that the Greek cultural tradition had always maintained. The satire that the poet Sotades directed at the marriage, a poem so caustic in its personal attacks that the tradition records Ptolemy II having the poet thrown into the sea in a sealed jar, gives some sense of how the marriage appeared to contemporary observers with insufficient deference to royal power. But the political dimensions were equally real. Egyptian pharaonic tradition, which the Ptolemaic dynasty was working to embody and continue, had a long history of sibling or half-sibling marriages within the royal family, a practice that concentrated power within the dynasty and prevented the formation of competing royal lines through marriage into outside families. Arsinoe II was, by several accounts, a woman of formidable political intelligence, and the influence she exercised on Ptolemy II's reign before her death in approximately 270 BC was substantial. After her death, Ptolemy II deified her in a ceremony that established the specific form of the royal cult that would become one of the defining features of Ptolemaic religious policy. The worship of the reigning and recently deceased monarchs as gods, integrated into the existing Egyptian and Greek religious frameworks in the characteristic Ptolemaic style of synthesis and mutual accommodation. The deification of Arsinoe and the establishment of her cult across Egypt was not simply an expression of personal grief. It was a political act consolidating the specific theological framework within which the Ptolemaic dynasty understood and presented its own authority. All of this, the commercial ambitions, the cultural investments, the diplomatic reach, the dynastic politics, the religious innovation, happened simultaneously, across the decades of a reign that the ancient sources describe with fragments and episodes rather than systematic narrative. Assembling the full picture requires the patience of the archaeologist and the papyrologist as much as the literary historian. The picture that emerges from that assembly is one of extraordinary richness and extraordinary complexity. That picture is what the following sections of this account are built to convey. The scale of Ptolemy II's reign, in the most concrete terms available. 38 years of rule over the most economically productive territory in the ancient world, generating revenues that no other Hellenistic kingdom could match, deployed across a building program that produced the Pharos lighthouse, the completed library, and the developed museum, a commercial network reaching from the Aegean to India. A diplomatic program that engaged every significant power in the known world, and a cultural synthesis that made Alexandria the most important city in the Mediterranean basin for the next several centuries. This was the scale of the achievement. Now the account examines how it was produced. The central problem of Ptolemy II's reign was not the military challenges, the Syrian wars, the competition with Seleucid and Macedonian power, the ongoing management of the Eastern Mediterranean's complex diplomacy. Those were real and required real responses, but they were the surface expressions of a deeper problem that every great civilizational project faces at the moment when the founding vision is being realized, the problem of scale. The founding vision of Ptolemy I had been specific and achievable. Take Egypt, build Alexandria, establish the library, maintain the Egyptian institutional traditions, create a kingdom that could sustain itself without depending on the personal genius of its founder. This vision had been achieved. Ptolemy II inherited a functioning state, a functioning city, and a functioning library. The question was, what do you do with a functioning state, a functioning city, and a functioning library when the potential of what you have built is far larger than what has actually been realized? The specific problem was the problem of realizing ambition at scale without losing the coherence that had made the founding vision successful. Building a library that held every significant text in the known world was a different problem from building the founding collection. Managing diplomatic relationships with India and sub-Saharan Africa was a different problem from managing the immediate neighborhood of the Eastern Mediterranean. Developing the Red Sea trade to a level of systematic commercial significance was a different problem from the opportunistic commercial activities of the founding generation. Integrating the Greek and Egyptian populations of an increasingly cosmopolitan city into a stable, productive, mutually beneficial social order was a different problem. As the population grew and the institutions multiplied, and the specific arrangements of the founding generation were no longer adequate to the scale that had been achieved. Ptolemy II solved these problems, not perfectly, not without the specific tensions and failures that any ambitious governing program generates, but with sufficient success that the results define the period as the high point of the dynasty. Understanding how he solved them requires understanding the specific mechanisms he used. The first and most fundamental mechanisms was the systematic development of the administrative apparatus that his father had begun. The nome system, the tax farming structure, the dual Greek-Egyptian administrative hierarchy. All of these had been established by Ptolemy I in their initial forms. Ptolemy II refined and extended them into a genuinely comprehensive administrative system capable of managing the specific challenges of a large, diverse, cosmopolitan population in an increasingly complex commercial and diplomatic environment. The most significant administrative innovation of Ptolemy II's reign was the development of the oikonomos system, a layer of financial officials below the level of the nomarchs and strategoi who were responsible for managing the specific financial and commercial activities of each administrative district. The oikonomoi were not simply tax collectors. They were the administrators of a comprehensive state economic system in which the royal government maintained a monopoly or a dominant position across a remarkable range of commercial activities: the production and sale of papyrus, the production and distribution of certain categories of oil, the operation of certain categories of textile production, the management of money-changing operations, and the oversight of commercial transactions of significant size in each district. The papyrological evidence for this system, assembled from the scattered documents recovered across a century and more of Egyptian papyrology, reveals an administrative apparatus of remarkable sophistication. The revenue laws of Ptolemy II, a papyrus document of exceptional importance that was discovered in the 19th century and published in a landmark edition by the papyrologist Bernard Grenfell in 1896 CE, preserves the specific legal and administrative regulations governing the oil monopoly and other aspects of the Ptolemaic revenue system. When Grenfell and his collaborator Arthur Hunt published this document, which they recovered in fragments from the rubbish heaps of ancient Oxyrhynchus, they recognized immediately that it was one of the most important administrative documents from the ancient world, a comprehensive regulatory system of extraordinary sophistication, anticipating in its specific provisions the kind of systematic commercial regulation that modern states have developed. The revenue laws reveal a system that was doing something genuinely new in the ancient world: the systematic management of a state economy through detailed regulatory provisions, rather than simply through the direct coercion of labor and the seizure of agricultural surplus. The system created specific rights and obligations for specific categories of economic actors: farmers who grew certain crops, manufacturers who produced certain products, merchants who sold certain goods, and managed the distribution of economic activity through legal frameworks rather than purely through force. This was not simply administratively clever, it was strategically important. A state that manages its economy through regulatory frameworks rather than purely through coercion is a state whose economic subjects have an interest in the legal system's functioning, have something to gain from cooperation rather than simply something to lose from resistance. The Ptolemaic regulatory system created, over time, a commercial population that had genuine stakes in the stability of the state and its legal institutions, because their commercial activities depended on those institutions for their legal validity. This was the specific administrative genius of the Ptolemaic system at its peak, and it was a system that Ptolemy II developed into its most complete form. But here's the problem, and it runs deeper than the administrative question. The administrative system that Ptolemy II developed was remarkable in its efficiency and remarkable in its sophistication. It was also, in its very sophistication, the expression of a fundamental tension in the Ptolemaic project that no administrative innovation could fully resolve. The tension was this: the system depended, for its functioning, on the simultaneous maintenance of two genuinely different and in some ways incompatible institutional worlds: the Greek administrative world, the oikonomoi and the strategos and the commercial regulatory system, and the Greek courts and the Greek civic institutions of Alexandria and the other Greek urban centers operated according to Greek legal and cultural assumptions and required Greek-speaking, Greek-educated officials to function. The Egyptian institutional world, the nome system at its traditional levels, the temple establishments, the Egyptian priestly hierarchy, the Egyptian rural population, organized according to Egyptian legal and social conventions, operated according to Egyptian legal and cultural assumptions, and required Egyptian-educated officials embedded in the Egyptian institutional tradition, managing the relationship between these two worlds, maintaining the integrity of both while creating the specific points of interface where they needed to cooperate, was the central administrative challenge of the Ptolemaic state. And the higher the ambitions of the state, the more complex that management became. Ptolemy II managed it with more success than most of his successors would achieve. The specific mechanisms he used, the precise allocation of responsibilities between Greek and Egyptian administrative tiers, the maintenance of the temple establishment's institutional autonomy, the specific legal provisions that governed interactions between Greek and Egyptian legal systems, the careful management of the royal cult in ways that resonated across both traditions, are visible in the papyrological evidence and in the surviving monumental inscriptions in ways that allow a fairly detailed reconstruction of how the system worked. But the system was always under tension. The specific moments when the tension surfaced, when Greek administrative demands conflicted with Egyptian temple privileges, when Greek commercial activities violated Egyptian customary practices, when the growing Greek population of Alexandria pressed against the specific institutional arrangements that had been designed for a smaller and less cosmopolitan city, are also visible in the evidence, though they tend to be less prominently recorded than the successes. And it gets more complex. The specific character of Alexandria's growing population was itself a source of tension that the administrative system had to manage continuously. Alexandria in the reign of Ptolemy II was genuinely cosmopolitan in a way that no previous city in the ancient world had been. Greek speakers from dozens of different cities and regions, Egyptians from across the Nile Valley, Jews who formed one of the largest and most organizationally sophisticated diaspora communities in the ancient world, Phoenicians, Arabs, Persians, Indians, and representatives of every other culture that the commercial networks of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Red Sea brought into contact with the Ptolemaic capital, managing the specific legal, religious, and social needs of this population, maintaining the conditions under which each group could practice its own traditions while also functioning as part of a coherent city, was an extraordinary administrative challenge. The specific arrangements that Ptolemy II developed for managing the Jewish population of Alexandria, including the creation of the specific legal status and the specific institutional arrangements that governed the Jewish community's relationship to the Ptolemaic state, were among the most consequential administrative decisions of his reign because they created a model for the accommodation of distinct religious communities within a cosmopolitan state that would influence the governance of diverse urban populations for the next several centuries. The translation of the Hebrew scriptures into Greek, the Septuagint, produced at Alexandria under Ptolemaic patronage in the 3rd century BC, was both an expression of this accommodation and one of its most consequential products. The story of the translation, as preserved in the letter of Aristeas and in subsequent tradition, presents it as a royal commission, Ptolemy II inviting 72 Jewish scholars to Alexandria and requesting a Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures for the library. Whether the historical reality was exactly this, whether the translation was a royal commission or a community initiative or some combination of both, is debated by scholars. What is not debated is that the translation was produced at Alexandria in the 3rd century BC, and that it was the version of the Hebrew scriptures that shaped the theological development of Greek-speaking Judaism, early Christianity, and ultimately the entire Western religious tradition. Here is what makes this truly sobering when you look at the full scope of the consequence. The specific religious tradition that shaped the moral and theological framework of Western civilization for the past 2,000 years. The tradition that produced Christianity, that shaped Islam's engagement with the Hebrew scriptural tradition, that formed the theological vocabulary within which the major intellectual movements of Western history have operated. That tradition reached the Greek-speaking world in the form that made it transmissible through the specific act of a translation produced in Alexandria under the patronage of Ptolemy II Philadelphus. This is not science fiction. This is what the scholarly consensus on the Septuagint's origins says when the evidence is read carefully. A Ptolemaic king's decision to support the translation of the Hebrew scriptures into Greek is one of the most consequential single acts of patronage in human history, and it happened in Alexandria in the 3rd century BC, during the reign of the builder of the library and the pharos. The core problem of Ptolemy II's reign was the problem of realizing ambition at scale. He solved it more completely than any of his predecessors or successors could manage, and the solutions he found shaped the world more deeply than the military campaigns of any other ruler of his era. The following section examines how those solutions were found and what they produced. The specific administrative tool that most visibly expressed the ambition and the challenge of Ptolemy II's governance was the Ptolemaic system of royal monopolies, the state control of certain key sectors of the Egyptian economy that generated revenue while simultaneously giving the royal administration a point of leverage over the commercial activities of the country's population. The monopolies are well documented in the revenue laws and in the Zenon papyri, and their specific character reveals something important about the specific nature of Ptolemaic economic thinking. The most important monopolies were in papyrus, in certain categories of oil production, and in money changing. These were not monopolies in the modern sense of the government owning all production and distribution directly. They were regulatory monopolies. The state controlled the legal framework within which these activities could be conducted, required licenses for participation, set prices and quality standards, and captured a substantial portion of the commercial value through taxation and licensing fees. The papyrus monopoly is particularly significant because papyrus was not simply a commercial product. It was the primary writing material of the ancient world, the material on which the library was written, on which commercial contracts were recorded, on which administrative documents were produced, on which the philosophical and literary and scientific work of the ancient world was done. Controlling the production and distribution of papyrus was, in a very real sense, controlling a significant portion of the infrastructure of ancient literacy and learning. This connection between the commercial monopoly and the cultural project of the library was not accidental. The Egyptian papyrus industry, centered in the delta marshes where the papyrus plant grew in abundance, was one of the primary sources of the raw material on which the library's collection was built. Ptolemy II's management of the papyrus monopoly gave him a degree of control over the supply of writing material that was significant for the library's acquisitions program. It also generated revenue that could be deployed toward the library's other needs: the purchase of texts from abroad, the support of the scholars, the physical infrastructure of the institution. The integration of commercial policy and cultural investment in the specific case of the papyrus monopoly is a microcosm of the broader integration that characterized Ptolemy II's governing intelligence, the recognition that commercial, administrative, and cultural objectives were not separate domains to be managed independently, but aspects of a single system that could be organized to reinforce each other. The Syrian Wars, the series of conflicts with the Seleucid kingdom for control of Coele-Syria that punctuated Ptolemy II's reign, are the military events that ancient historiography most prominently records for this period because ancient historiography preferred military narrative over administrative analysis. The wars were real, and their outcomes were significant. The First Syrian War, fought in the 270s BC, ended with a Ptolemaic victory that secured Ptolemaic control of Coele-Syria and Cyprus, and demonstrated that the Egyptian military machine, the professional mercenary force, the substantial navy, was capable of effective offensive as well as defensive operations. The Second Syrian War, in the 260s BC, was more complicated, ending with a settlement that preserved Ptolemaic gains, but at some cost. But the specific military outcomes of these wars, important as they were for the territorial configuration of the Ptolemaic kingdom, were less significant in the long run than the administrative and commercial developments that continued throughout and around them. Ptolemy II was not primarily a military ruler. He was a commercial and administrative ruler who maintained a military capability sufficient to protect and expand his commercial interests, and who deployed that military capability with the specific intelligence of someone who understood it as a tool rather than as an end in itself. The Greek historian Theocritus of Syracuse, who came to Alexandria in the early reign of Ptolemy II and produced his Idylls, one of the most important works of Hellenistic poetry, in the court environment, wrote a specific poem in praise of Ptolemy II that is one of the most important pieces of evidence for how his reign was perceived and presented by the cultural community he supported. The poem, known as Idyll 17, is both a piece of genuine literary craft and a piece of royal propaganda. The two things are not in contradiction in the context of Hellenistic court poetry, and it lists the specific achievements and qualities that the poet identified as defining the ruler's character and reign. What Theocritus emphasizes is not military glory. He praises the wealth of Egypt, the extent of the commercial networks, the effectiveness of the administration, the patronage of learning, and the specific qualities of intelligence and judgment that he attributes to Ptolemy II as a ruler. He praises the library and the scholarly community. He praises the commercial reach that extends from Egypt to the boundaries of the known world. He presents Ptolemy II as the ruler most worthy of divine honor, precisely because of the quality and the breadth of what he has built, rather than because of the victories he has won on battlefields. This is a remarkable document because it shows a contemporary observer writing from within the Ptolemaic cultural community, articulating the specific vision of royal achievement that the reign of Ptolemy II embodied. The vision of the ruler as builder and patron rather than as conqueror. The vision of civilizational achievement rather than military dominance as the appropriate measure of a king's greatness. The vision was not simply Theocritus's own. It was the vision that Ptolemy II's entire administrative and cultural program expressed, and it was, in the specific context of the early 3rd century BC Hellenistic world, a genuinely innovative vision, a departure from the Macedonian military tradition that had defined the Diadochi generation's understanding of what a king should be and what a kingdom should achieve. The ancient historian Pausanias, writing several centuries later, described Ptolemy II as the king who did more for the Greeks than any other king. This judgment, made from the perspective of a Greek writer looking back on the Hellenistic period, reflects specifically the cultural patronage, the commercial connections, and the specific contributions to Greek literary and scholarly life that Alexandria under Ptolemy II had produced. It is not a judgment about military achievement, it is a judgment about civilizational contribution. That judgment has stood. 2,000 years of subsequent scholarship have confirmed it, refined it, and extended its implications. Ptolemy II Philadelphus did more than any other single ruler of the Hellenistic period to create the specific intellectual and cultural world that shaped the development of Greek, Roman, Jewish, early Christian, and ultimately modern civilization. This is the core of the problem and its solution. The problem was how to build a civilization at scale. The solution was to build with intelligence, with patience, with genuine engagement with the traditions being synthesized, and with the specific understanding that the most durable investments are in institutions, libraries, scholarly communities, commercial systems, administrative frameworks, rather than in military campaigns or personal monuments. Ptolemy II understood this. He built accordingly, and the buildings lasted. The specific challenge of the growing Jewish community of Alexandria deserves sustained attention here, because it is one of the best documented cases of the administrative and cultural accommodations that Ptolemy II had to manage, and because its consequences reach further into the future than almost any other single aspect of his reign. The Jewish community of Alexandria was, by the time of Ptolemy II's reign, already substantial, the result of both voluntary immigration and the specific circumstances of various Levantine conflicts that had produced refugees and resettled populations across the Ptolemaic territories. Egyptian Jews under the early Ptolemies were not a homogeneous group. They included recent immigrants from Judea, descendants of earlier settlements going back to the Babylonian period, and populations that had been resettled in Egypt under various circumstances across the preceding centuries. They were organized into specific community structures, politeomata, the Greek term for legally recognized community organizations, that governed their internal affairs according to their own traditions, while maintaining defined relationships with the Ptolemaic administrative system. The specific challenge that the Jewish community presented to the Ptolemaic administrative system was the challenge of religious difference. A population whose observance of its distinctive religious practices, the dietary laws, the Sabbath, the synagogue worship, the avoidance of the images and rituals of the Ptolemaic royal cult, put it in a different relationship to the specific institutional arrangements of the Ptolemaic state than the Greek and Egyptian populations. The Ptolemaic state required participation in certain public rituals, the royal cult in particular, that the Jewish community could not participate in without violating the fundamental principles of its own religious tradition. The specific legal and administrative arrangements that Ptolemy II developed to accommodate this difference, arrangements that gave the Jewish community a recognized legal status, respected its internal governance structures, and allowed it to maintain its religious practices within defined limits, were among the most consequential administrative innovations of his reign. They created the template for the accommodation of distinct religious minorities within a pluralistic urban state that would shape Roman, Byzantine, and ultimately modern thinking about the management of religious diversity in complex societies. This is not an abstract or historical claim. The specific model of religious accommodation that the Ptolemaic state developed for its Jewish community, the model of a recognized minority community with defined legal rights and institutional autonomy within a larger state structure, was the model that the Roman Empire adapted and extended when it encountered the same challenge of managing Jewish and then early Christian communities across its vast territories. The path from Ptolemaic Alexandria to the Roman Empire's approaches to religious minority management is traceable and real. The letter of Aristeas, the document that describes the production of the Septuagint as a royal commission, is, among other things, a piece of evidence for this specific administrative and cultural accommodation. Whether or not its specific narrative of 72 scholars producing a miraculous translation is historically accurate in its details, the document reflects the real engagement between the Ptolemaic court and the Jewish scholarly community that the accommodation required. The Library of Alexandria was genuinely committed to collecting texts from all significant traditions. The Jewish scriptures were genuinely among the most important texts in the Near Eastern world. The translation of those scriptures into Greek was genuinely a project that served both the library's ambitions and the needs of the Greek-speaking Jewish community that needed them. The translation was done. The Septuagint exists. It shaped the next 2,000 years of religious history, and it was produced in Alexandria under Ptolemaic patronage during the reign of Ptolemy II Philadelphus. This is the core problem at its deepest, the problem of building something at scale that is genuinely new, not simply the Macedonian military tradition extended into Egypt, not simply the Egyptian pharaonic tradition continued under a Greek-speaking ruler, but something genuinely unprecedented, a cosmopolitan civilization that drew on both traditions and on the traditions of every other people who came into its orbit, and that created in that drawing together a specific cultural synthesis whose consequences for subsequent human history were extraordinary. Ptolemy II built that synthesis more completely than any predecessor or successor. The following sections examine the specific monuments and institutions and decisions through which he built it. One dimension of the core problem that this section has not yet addressed, but that shaped the entire character of Ptolemy II's reign, is the problem of legitimacy in its most specifically Ptolemaic form. Ptolemy I had established the basic framework, present oneself as pharaoh in Egyptian contexts, as Macedonian king in Greek contexts, and build the institutional relationships with the Egyptian priesthood, with the Greek population, with the intellectual community of Alexandria, that gave each form of presentation genuine content rather than mere theatrics. He had done this successfully enough that his son inherited not just a throne, but a genuine institutional legitimacy with the multiple constituencies that the Ptolemaic state served. But Ptolemy II inherited this legitimacy in a specific form that required active maintenance rather than passive possession. The Egyptian priesthood would continue to recognize Ptolemaic pharaonic legitimacy only as long as the Ptolemaic rulers maintained the specific commitments, the temple building, the ritual participation, the protection of priestly economic privileges that had been the basis of Ptolemy I's recognition. The Greek population would continue to accept Ptolemaic rule only as long as the specific benefits, the commercial prosperity, the cultural vitality, the security of legal and institutional frameworks that Ptolemaic governance provided continued to be delivered. The intellectual community at the library would continue to make Alexandria the center of the Hellenistic scholarly world, only as long as the library remained the best resourced, most comprehensive, and most institutionally supported scholarly environment available. Each of these forms of legitimacy had to be actively built and maintained. None of them was self-sustaining, and the specific challenge of Ptolemy II's reign was that each of them was becoming more complex and more demanding to maintain as the scale of the kingdom and the complexity of its populations increased. He maintained them. For 38 years, he kept the priests building their temples, the scholars writing their books, the merchants trading through his harbours, and the populations of a cosmopolitan city living together with sufficient stability that the enterprise continued to function and grow. This is the measure of his achievement. Not any single monument, not any single diplomatic triumph, the sustained maintenance across 4 decades of the conditions that made Alexandria extraordinary. That sustained maintenance is the core problem's core solution, and it is a solution that deserves the recognition it has not received. The silence around Ptolemy II in popular history is not a silence about a minor figure. It is a silence about the reign during which the most consequential intellectual institution in the history of the ancient world reached its greatest scope, during which the translation that shaped 2,000 years of Western religious history was produced, during which the most extraordinary lighthouse in the ancient world was built, during which the commercial networks that defined the Hellenistic world economy were most fully developed. The silence is about a builder, and builders, as this series has consistently demonstrated, are the figures most likely to be forgotten in favour of the conquerors who preceded and followed them. The building deserves to be seen. The builder deserves to be known. Now, the account moves to the specific chapters of exploration, the pharos, the library in its full realization, the scholars who made it extraordinary, the commercial world it sat at the center of, and the specific human encounters that give the reign its texture and its humanity. Now the builder becomes visible. The pharos lighthouse, the library in its mature form, the translation of the Hebrew scriptures, the commercial empire reaching to India. Each of these achievements is a chapter in the story of a reign whose significance has been systematically underestimated by the popular historical imagination. Each deserves its own careful examination, and together they form the picture of one of the most consequential reigns in the entire history of the ancient world. That picture begins now. The Ptolemy who built all of this was not a remote abstraction. He was a specific human being with specific tastes, specific relationships, specific moments of success and failure, specific personal qualities that the ancient sources allow us to see, however imperfectly and however partially. The builder of Alexandria's wonders was also a man who married his sister, who executed a half-brother, who was described as physically impressive but intellectually more impressive still, who hosted the most extraordinary public spectacle in the ancient world, and funded the most ambitious scholarly project in ancient history simultaneously. He was, as this account will demonstrate, one of the most remarkable individuals of his extraordinarily remarkable era. The full picture awaits. 3,000 years of Egyptian civilization had reached, under Ptolemy I's founding vision, the specific moment of synthesis with the post-Alexander Greek world that the previous accounts in this series have been building toward. Now, under Ptolemy II, that synthesis reached its fullest early expression. The product of the synthesis, Alexandria at its greatest, the library at its most ambitious, the scholarship at its most productive, is what this account now examines in the full detail it deserves. And underneath it all, under the administrative sophistication, under the commercial ambition, under the scholarly patronage and the diplomatic reach, is the recognition that has been building throughout this account, that the specific intersection of Greek intellectual ambition and Egyptian's institutional depth that Alexandria represented was unique in the history of the ancient world, and that the ruler who most completely realized its potential, was Ptolemy II Philadelphus, the brother lover, the builder of the Pharos and the library, and the commercial empire that made Alexandria the center of the ancient world. The full story of that realization begins in the following section. Nothing in the Hellenistic world quite prepared observers for what Alexandria became under his reign. The city that his father had begun was recognizably extraordinary. The city that he completed was something that contemporaries described with the language of wonder. Not the conventional flattery of court poets, but the genuine astonishment of visitors who had seen every other significant city of the Hellenistic world and still found themselves unprepared for the scale, the sophistication, and the sheer intellectual vitality of Ptolemaic Alexandria at the peak of its ambition. That astonishment is the subject, that peak is the story. It is time to look at it directly. 5,000 words to reach this point, every one of them building toward the specific question that this account exists to answer. What, exactly, did Ptolemy II build, and why does it matter to us now, 23 centuries after the last stone was laid? The answer begins in the harbour, with the light in the harbour, the books in the library, the words in the 70 languages of the ancient world, and behind all of it, the specific intelligence of a specific ruler who understood what he was building and why it mattered. Now we look directly at each of these in turn. Now, the harbour of Alexandria in 270 BC looked different from every other harbour in the ancient Mediterranean world. The Pharos was finished, the light was burning, and the library was open. This is where the story of what Ptolemy II built becomes most completely visible. Chapter 1. The Pharos. The ancient descriptions of the Pharos lighthouse are so extraordinary, so specific in their details, and so consistent across multiple independent ancient sources that modern architectural historians and engineers have been able to produce quite detailed reconstructive models of a building that has not existed since the medieval period. The Pharos was built on a small island at the entrance to the great harbour of Alexandria, an island connected to the mainland by a causeway called the Heptastadion, the seven-stadium causeway that divided the harbour into two sections and provided the city with the dual harbour infrastructure that was essential for the commercial traffic of the most important port in the ancient Mediterranean. The island had been identified by Alexander himself as the site for a lighthouse. The same passage from Arrian's account of the founding of Alexandria that records Alexander laying out the city also mentions his instruction to build a lighthouse on the Pharos island, which is how the island gave its name to the lighthouse type in ancient Greek and thus to the English word pharos, used in technical contexts today. But Alexander had not built it. Ptolemy I had begun the construction, and it was Ptolemy II who completed it in approximately 270 BC, roughly 15 years into his own reign. The ancient sources give the height as between 130 and 160 meters. Modern engineering analyses suggest the lower figure is more plausible given the construction technology of the era. Even at 130 meters, the Pharos was the tallest artificial structure in the ancient world, after the Great Pyramid at Giza, a distinction it held for most of the subsequent period until the medieval construction of tall cathedral towers in Europe. The structure had three sections, stacked on each other with diminishing size: a square base section, an octagonal middle section, and a cylindrical top section from which the fire burned, and the mirror system reflected and amplified the light outward across the sea. At its peak, by the ancient accounts, the light could be seen at distances of between 40 and 50 kilometers, far enough to be visible from the approaches to the harbour while a ship was still well out to sea, giving the navigational warning time to adjust course before encountering the shallow coastal waters and hidden hazards of the delta approach. The architect of the Pharos was Sostratus of Cnidus. This name is preserved in several ancient sources, and it is associated with one of the more charming stories in the entire history of ancient architecture, the story that Sostratus wished to inscribe his own name on the lighthouse as the builder, but was required by Ptolemy II to inscribe the king's name. Sostratus reportedly resolved this conflict by inscribing the king's name in plaster over a deeper inscription in stone that gave his own name and dedication, so that when the plaster eventually weathered away, as plaster does, what remained was his own name and his dedication to the gods of safety on behalf of those who sail the seas. Whether this story is true is uncertain. It has the quality of an anecdote that has been improved in the retelling, the kind that accumulates around clever craftsmen in conflict with powerful patrons. But the specific detail of Sostratus's name associated with the Pharos appears in multiple independent sources, and the architect's identity as a man from Cnidus, a major Aegean city with a strong tradition of artistic and intellectual accomplishment, is consistent with the broader pattern of Ptolemy II's patronage, which drew talent from across the Greek-speaking world. The modern scholar who has done the most systematic analysis of the ancient descriptions of the Pharos and their implications for reconstructing its appearance is the American architect Hermann Tiesch, whose monograph on the Pharos, published in 1909 CE, assembled the ancient textual evidence with the surviving Arabic medieval descriptions, which are more detailed in some respects than the ancient Greek accounts, because the lighthouse was still partially standing when medieval Arab travellers visited Alexandria, into a comprehensive attempt at physical reconstruction. Tiesch's work has been refined and supplemented by subsequent scholars, but his basic reconstruction remains the starting point for all subsequent discussions of the building's appearance. What the reconstructions show is a building of extraordinary ambition and considerable engineering sophistication. The challenge of constructing a stable structure of this height in the coastal location the Pharos occupied, using the stone and mortar technologies of the 3rd century BC, was significant. The specific solutions that Sostratus and his engineers developed, the specific foundation design, the wall construction methods, the internal structure that distributed the enormous weight of the upper sections, are not fully recoverable from the ancient descriptions, but the fact of the building's stability across more than 1,000 years of operation suggests that the engineering was well done. The Pharos was eventually destroyed by a series of earthquakes between the 12th and 14th centuries CE. By the time the last significant earthquake struck, in 1375 CE, by the commonly cited medieval account, the building had already been severely damaged and only partial sections remained standing. The Mamluk Sultan Qayet Bey built a fortress on the same island in the late 15th century CE, incorporating the remains of the Pharos's foundation into his construction. The fortress, known as the Citadel of Qayet Bey, still stands on the island today, and underwater archaeological investigations in the harbour of Alexandria have found large blocks of carved stone on the harbour floor that are almost certainly fragments of the original Pharos structure fallen from the building during the earthquakes that destroyed it. The modern visitor to Alexandria can stand at the citadel of Qayet Bey, look out over the harbour where the Pharos once burned its fire, and understand something about the specific achievement of Ptolemy II, that he built something so useful, so structurally sound, and so precisely placed at the most important navigational challenge of the most important harbour in the ancient world, that it remained in continuous operation for more than 1,000 years before the earth finally shook it down. The numbers are striking. 1,400 years of continuous operation, the same institution serving the same function for a span of time that reaches from the founding of the Ptolemaic dynasty to the present day and beyond. The light burned when Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria. The light burned when Cleopatra died and the Ptolemaic dynasty ended. The light burned through the Roman period and the Byzantine period and into the early Islamic period. It was one of the most durable pieces of human engineering in the ancient world, and it was built during the reign of Ptolemy II Philadelphus. Chapter 2. The library in its greatest period. The Library of Alexandria has been discussed in the previous account of Ptolemy I, which established its founding vision and the specific intellectual program it represented. Now it is time to examine the library as it actually functioned during the reign of Ptolemy II. In its greatest period, under the most talented scholar librarians it ever employed, producing the work that defined the intellectual culture of the Hellenistic world. The first scholar librarian, or at least the first to be clearly identified in the ancient sources as holding something like a leadership role at the library, was Zenodotus of Ephesus, who served during the earliest decades of the institution's operation, likely under both Ptolemy I and Ptolemy II. Zenodotus was primarily a textual scholar, and his most important work was the first systematic critical edition of Homer, the editing of the Iliad and the Odyssey into the specific textual forms that would become the basis for all subsequent transmission of these foundational works of Greek literature. The significance of this achievement is difficult to overstate. Homer was not simply a literary figure in the ancient Greek world. He was the foundational cultural text, the work that every educated Greek had read, that every philosophical argument referenced, that every cultural debate drew on. The specific textual form of Homer that Zenodotus established at Alexandria. By comparing multiple manuscript traditions, selecting what he judged to be the most authentic readings, and producing an edited text that the library then copied and distributed, became the basis for the Homeric text that the entire subsequent tradition inherited. Every subsequent edition of Homer, in antiquity and in the modern world, descends from the Alexandrian text that Zenodotus established in the library, that Ptolemy II had developed to its greatest scope. The next figure in the library's history, and one of the most important scholars in the entire history of the ancient world, was Callimachus of Cyrene, who worked at the library during the reign of Ptolemy II, and whose intellectual contributions were so significant and so wide-ranging that the ancient tradition simply called him the scholar, as if no other designation were needed. Callimachus is known to modern readers primarily as a poet of extraordinary elegance and learning, whose hymns and epigrams have survived in substantial portions and whose influence on subsequent Latin poetry, most significantly on the work of Catullus and Ovid, was profound. But his most important contribution to human intellectual history was not his poetry. It was the Pinaces, the tables, the first comprehensive bibliography of the entire Greek literary tradition. The Pinax was a catalogue of everything in the library's collection, organized by author and genre, providing for each work a brief account of the author's life, an assessment of the work's authenticity, and a synopsis of its content. It ran, by the ancient accounts, to 120 books, meaning 120 papyrus rolls of substantial length. It was the first attempt in human history to produce a comprehensive, systematically organized guide to the accumulated literary production of a civilization. The Pinax no longer exists. It is among the most important lost works in the history of scholarship, but its existence is attested by multiple ancient sources. Fragments of it have been recovered from various ancient quotations and references, and its influence on subsequent bibliographical and scholarly traditions is traceable through the works that drew on it. The classification system that Callimachus developed, the organization of literature by genre and author, the systematic annotation of each work, the assessment of authenticity, became the template for every subsequent attempt at a comprehensive literary catalogue, and can be traced through the chain of bibliographical tradition, all the way to the classification systems used by modern libraries. Let that sink in. The classification system of modern libraries, the conceptual framework by which books are organized, identified, and made findable within a large collection, traces its intellectual ancestry to the work done by Callimachus at the Library of Alexandria in the 3rd century BC during the reign of Ptolemy II Philadelphus, the next great figure of the Alexandrian scholarly tradition, and perhaps the most astonishing single intellectual of the entire ancient world, was Eratosthenes of Cyrene, who became the third head of the library, appointed by Ptolemy III Gigetes after Apollonius of Rhodes. But Eratosthenes did his foundational work at Alexandria during a period that bridges the reigns of Ptolemy II and his successor, and his contributions are so directly connected to the specific intellectual culture that Ptolemy II created that they belong in this account. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the earth. He did it in approximately 240 BC, using a method of elegant simplicity, comparing the angle of the sun's rays at Alexandria with the known fact that at Syene, modern Aswan, on the Nile, the sun was directly overhead at noon on the summer solstice. From the angle difference and the known distance between the two cities, he calculated the Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy. His estimate, depending on the specific value of the unit of measurement he used, was within 1 to 3% of the actual circumference. The achievement is extraordinary in itself, but what makes it especially significant for understanding the intellectual culture of Ptolemaic Alexandria is the specific kind of thinking it represents. The integration of astronomical observation, geographical knowledge, and mathematical calculation to answer a question that was not simply academic, but was directly relevant to the commercial and navigational activities of the Ptolemaic state. The geography of Eratosthenes, his systematic attempt to map the known world on the basis of astronomical and geographical observation, was a project with immediate practical applications for the commercial empire that Ptolemy II had built, and that his successors were maintaining. This is the character of Alexandrian scholarship at its best, not abstract intellectual play, but the integration of rigorous theoretical work with practical applications of direct relevance to the commercial and administrative challenges of the world's most sophisticated state. The library was not an ivory tower. It was, at its most vital, the intellectual workshop of the most commercially and diplomatically active kingdom in the ancient world. Chapter 3. The Scholars and Their Disputes. The scholarly community of Alexandria in the reign of Ptolemy II was not simply a collection of brilliant individuals working in isolation. It was a community, a genuine intellectual community, with the specific character of communities. The collaborations, the friendships, the rivalries, the disagreements, the petty quarrels, and the occasional moments of genuine mutual inspiration that make any intellectual community more than the sum of its individual members. The most famous quarrel in the entire history of Alexandrian scholarship, the dispute between Callimachus and Apollonius of Rhodes, is one of the most revealing episodes in the cultural history of the Hellenistic world, because it reveals the specific intellectual tensions that characterized the Ptolemaic scholarly project at the height of its ambition. Apollonius was born at Alexandria, or possibly at Naucratis, and was in some accounts a student of Callimachus before their dispute. He wrote the Argonautica, an epic poem on the subject of Jason and the Argonauts, in deliberate defiance of Callimachus's aesthetic principles. Callimachus had argued, in his literary critical work and in his own poetry, that the long epic form was exhausted, that the attempt to produce a Homeric epic in the Hellenistic period was both technically misguided and culturally retrograde, a failure to understand what was new and vital in the literary culture of the time. He preferred the shorter, more refined, more elusive forms of poetry that his own hymns and epigrams represented. Poetry that repaid close attention, that assumed a sophisticated reader, that worked through suggestion and compression rather than through the extended narrative sweep of the epic tradition. Apollonius wrote his epic anyway. The Argonautica is a work of genuine literary quality. It was used by Virgil as one of his primary models for the Aeneid, and it remains one of the most readable long poems in Greek. But the dispute between its author and Callimachus, a dispute that appears to have been personal as well as intellectual, involving accusations and counter-accusations that the ancient sources preserve in fragmentary and sometimes contradictory forms, was also a dispute about the nature of poetry, the purpose of literary tradition, and the specific relationship between the Alexandrian scholarly project and the Greek literary heritage. The scholar Peter Fraser, whose monumental two-volume study Ptolemaic Alexandria, published in 1972 CE, remains the most comprehensive modern account of Alexandrian intellectual and cultural life, described the Callimachus-Apollonius dispute as one of the most important literary controversies in the history of the ancient world, not because of the intrinsic merits of either side, but because the dispute articulated, with unusual clarity and unusual passion, the specific tensions within the Hellenistic literary tradition that the Alexandrian project had brought to the surface. The Alexandrian scholars were heirs to a tradition so rich, so deep, and so authoritative that the question of how to relate to it, whether to extend it, to subvert it, to select from it, to imitate it, or to transcend it, was one of the most urgent intellectual questions of the era. Callimachus and Apollonius gave different answers to this question, and the dispute between them was a dispute about the right relationship between the present and the past. A question that was not simply literary but was, in the specific context of the Ptolemaic state, also a question about cultural identity, about what the Hellenistic world was and what it should become. That these questions were being argued in Alexandria, in the library and the museum, that Ptolemy II had developed into the intellectual centre of the world is itself a testament to what his patronage had produced. The scholars were not simply doing the ruler's bidding. They were arguing passionately and with genuine intellectual engagement about the most fundamental questions of their cultural world. This is what the library was at its best, not a repository. A conversation. Chapter 4. The Septuagint and the World It Made, the translation of the Hebrew Scriptures into Greek. The text known as the Septuagint, from the Latin for 70, reflecting the tradition of 72 translators, was produced in Alexandria in the 3rd century BC. The specific dating of various parts of the translation is a matter of ongoing scholarly debate, but the consensus places the translation of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Scriptures, in the reign of Ptolemy II Philadelphus, around 280 to 250 BC. The letter of Aristeas, a pseudonymous document that presents itself as the account of an official at the Ptolemaic court who oversaw the translation, is the most detailed ancient source for the production of the Septuagint. The letter describes Demetrius of Phaleron, the same intellectual figure who had helped design the library, approaching Ptolemy II with the suggestion that the library's collection of Jewish scriptures was inadequate, consisting only of inferior copies in Hebrew, and recommending the commission of a proper translation into Greek. Ptolemy agrees, sends an embassy to Jerusalem, and receives 72 scholars, 6 from each of the 12 tribes of Israel, who are brought to Alexandria and housed on the island of Pharos, where they produce their translation in 72 days. The letter of Aristeas is not straightforwardly historical. Scholars have identified it as a work of propaganda, produced within the Alexandrian Jewish community to assert the divine authority of the Greek translation against challenges to its accuracy and legitimacy. The specific narrative elements, the 72 scholars, the 72 days, the miraculous unanimity of the result, are legendary accretions rather than historical reporting. But the core historical fact that a Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures was produced at Alexandria in the 3rd century BC under Ptolemaic patronage for the use of the Greek-speaking Jewish community and for the library's collection is not in doubt. The Septuagint exists, it was produced, and its production had consequences of extraordinary magnitude. The most immediate consequence was for the Alexandrian Jewish community, which gained access to its own scriptural tradition in the language its members actually spoke and read. By the 3rd century BC, the Jewish diaspora communities of Egypt and elsewhere in the eastern Mediterranean were Greek-speaking. Hebrew was for many of them a scholarly language rather than a vernacular, and the availability of the scriptures in Greek made them accessible in daily life in a way that the Hebrew originals were not. The larger consequence was for the entire subsequent history of the Jewish and then the Christian tradition. When the early Christian movement spread through the Greek-speaking world of the Roman Empire, it spread with the Septuagint as its scripture, the text that the first Christian communities read, quoted, and interpreted as the foundational document of their faith. When Paul of Tarsus quoted the Hebrew Scriptures in his letters, he was almost always quoting the Septuagint. When the authors of the New Testament wrote, they were working within a scriptural tradition that was specifically the Septuagint, the specific theological vocabulary that the New Testament developed, the specific Greek terms that carried the theological meanings that shaped Christian doctrine, was rooted in the specific translation choices made by the Septuagint translators, the subsequent history of Western theology, of Western philosophy, and of Western civilization more broadly was profoundly shaped by the specific forms of theological and conceptual expression that the Septuagint established. And the Septuagint was produced in Alexandria under Ptolemaic patronage during the reign of Ptolemy II Philadelphus. Chapter 5. The Commercial World and its Reach. The commercial empire that Ptolemy II built and managed was, in its geographic reach and its organizational sophistication, unlike anything the ancient Mediterranean world had previously produced. The Aegean component of the empire, the naval and commercial presence in the eastern Mediterranean that the Ptolemaic fleet maintained, is the best documented in the ancient sources because it was the dimension most visible to the Greek historians and geographers who produced the texts that have survived. The fleet that Ptolemy II commanded was, at the peak of its power in the 260 and 250s BC, the dominant naval force in the eastern Mediterranean. It maintained Ptolemaic presence in the Aegean island leagues, supported the commercial activities of Greek merchants who traded with Egypt, and served as the military insurance for the commercial networks that generated so much of Ptolemaic revenue. The Red Sea component is less well documented in the literary sources, but is increasingly visible in the archaeological evidence. The Red Sea ports, Berenice, Myos Hormos, Arsinoe, and others, have been systematically excavated by modern archaeological teams over the past several decades, and the material evidence they have produced has dramatically expanded understanding of the scale and character of the Ptolemaic Red Sea trade. The site of ancient Berenice, on the Egyptian Red Sea coast near the modern Sudanese border, was excavated by the archaeologist Stephen Sidebotham and his colleagues beginning in 1994 CE. What they found was a port city of considerable scale and remarkable commercial diversity. The physical remains of warehouses, ship repair facilities, administrative buildings, and a material assemblage that included goods from India, Arabia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the Mediterranean world simultaneously. The specific goods represented in the Berenice assemblage: Indian pepper, Sri Lankan gemstones, Arabian incense, Sub-Saharan African ivory, Mediterranean amphorae of wine and olive oil, were the material evidence of the commercial connections that made the Ptolemaic Red Sea trade one of the most significant commercial enterprises in the ancient world. The discovery at Berenice of a Tamil Brahmi inscription, an inscription in an ancient South Indian script on a potsherd, was one of the most extraordinary individual finds of the excavation. A Tamil inscription at an Egyptian Red Sea port in the Ptolemaic or early Roman period provides direct physical evidence of the commercial connection between southern India and Ptolemaic Egypt that the literary sources had described, but that had previously lacked direct archaeological confirmation. The potsherd is a small object. The connection it represents spans the entire Indian Ocean. This is the commercial world that Ptolemy II built and managed, a network reaching from the Aegean to the South Indian coast, connecting the luxury goods of Asia with the agricultural surplus of Egypt, making Alexandria the commercial hub of the ancient world's most extensive trading system. The scholar Gary Young, in his study of Rome's Eastern trade, traced the specific commercial infrastructure that Rome inherited and extended when it took control of Egypt after Cleopatra's death in 30 BC. What Young found was that the Roman Red Sea trade, which generated some of the largest commercial revenues in the entire Roman imperial economy, was built on the specific infrastructure, the ports, the trade routes, the commercial relationships that the Ptolemaic period had established. The Ptolemaic commercial empire did not end with the dynasty. It was inherited by Rome and extended into the Roman imperial period, where it continued to generate extraordinary wealth. Ptolemy II built the foundation. Rome received the benefit. The foundation was that good. Chapter 6. The Zoological Gardens and Natural History. Among the less celebrated but genuinely significant aspects of Ptolemy II's cultural program was his development of what modern scholars recognize as the most comprehensive zoological collection in the ancient world, a collection of living animals from across the known world that served simultaneously as a royal display of commercial reach as a natural history research facility and as the material basis for some of the most important natural science work of the Hellenistic period. The animals that Ptolemy II maintained were documented in various ancient sources, and the inventory that can be reconstructed from these sources is remarkable in its breadth. Elephants from Africa and India. The war elephants whose acquisition was one of the purposes of the Red Sea expeditions. Bears, possibly polar bears, possibly Syrian bears. A python of extraordinary size, reportedly 18 meters long, that was displayed to enormous public interest. Ostriches, parrots, peacocks, guinea fowl, and other exotic birds. Ethiopian cattle with distinctive colouring, possibly a giraffe. The ancient sources mention what appears to be a description of a giraffe, an animal that Greek observers found extraordinarily strange and that they called a camelopard, meaning a camel leopard, apparently because they understood it as a hybrid of the two more familiar animals. The ancient Greek poet and natural historian Agatharchides of Cnidus, writing in the 2nd century BC, but drawing on earlier sources that included the records of Ptolemaic Red Sea expeditions, described in detail the specific animals and peoples encountered in sub-Saharan Africa by the Ptolemaic expedition commanders. His work, preserved in fragments by later writers, is one of the most important ancient documents for the history of Ptolemaic exploration and for the natural history of ancient sub-Saharan Africa. His descriptions are, in the judgment of modern specialists in ancient natural history, accurate and detailed enough to suggest direct observational sources, eyewitness accounts from people who had actually been to the places he describes. This specificity is characteristic of the intellectual culture that Ptolemy II's patronage produced. The natural history of the Hellenistic world was not simply the cataloguing of classical Greek knowledge. It was an active, outward-looking, empirically driven research program that gathered new observations from the furthest reaches of the commercial networks that the Ptolemaic state had built. The exotic animals in Ptolemy II's collection were not simply spectacles. They were specimens, data points in an ongoing research program that was extending the boundaries of Greek natural historical knowledge into territories that the classical tradition had only dimly perceived. The specific combination of commercial ahem and intellectual curiosity that this research program represented is one of the most characteristic expressions of what Ptolemy II's reign was about. The conviction that knowing more about the world was simultaneously an intellectual achievement, a commercial advantage, and a demonstration of the power that the Ptolemaic state commanded over the natural and human geography of the known world. He was right on all three counts. The research produced important knowledge, the knowledge supported the commercial activities, and the commercial activities demonstrated the power. The system was integrated, the integration was intentional, and the result was the most extraordinary civilization of the Hellenistic world. Chapter 7. Arsinoe and her influence. The role of Arsinoe II in the reign of Ptolemy II deserves specific attention because the ancient sources suggest, and modern scholars have increasingly argued, that her influence on his policies was substantial and in some cases transformative. Arsinoe II was, by the evidence of the ancient sources, a woman of formidable intelligence and considerable political experience. She had been a queen twice before her marriage to her brother, first as the wife of Lysimachus, the powerful Diadochi-era ruler of Thrace, and then in the disastrous marriage to Ptolemy Ceraunus that ended in catastrophe. By the time she returned to Egypt and became her brother's queen, she had seen more of the Hellenistic world's political reality than almost any other person alive. The ancient numismatic evidence, the coins that were issued in Arsinoe's name, both during her lifetime and in the posthumous cult that Ptolemy II established after her death, is among the most striking evidence for her position. She was depicted on coins as a queen in her own right, wearing the double cornucopia that became her specific attribute, presented with the full visual vocabulary of Hellenistic royal portraiture. She was worshipped after her death in temples built in her name across the Ptolemaic kingdom, and the cult that Ptolemy II established for her. The Thea Philadelphus, the sister-loving goddess, was integrated into the official Ptolemaic religious system in a way that made her a permanent presence in the ritual life of the kingdom. The modern scholar who has done the most systematic analysis of the evidence for Arsinoe's influence is the historian Huss Werner, who argued that specific foreign policy decisions of Ptolemy II's reign, including certain of the diplomatic maneuvers in the Syrian wars, bore the marks of Arsinoe's political intelligence rather than simply the king's. Whether this attribution is correct in its specific claims is uncertain. Attributing specific policy decisions to specific individuals in ancient courts is always difficult because the documentation does not usually preserve the internal deliberations of royal decision-making. But the broader argument that Arsinoe was a genuinely influential figure rather than simply a ceremonial queen is supported by the overall evidence. Her death around 270 BC was followed by the specific cultural and religious responses that Ptolemy II organized: the deification, the temples, the integration into the official cult, in ways that suggest genuine personal grief as much as political calculation. The ancient sources preserve anecdotes about his sorrow. He named a city after her. He built her portraits in temples across the kingdom. He made her posthumous worship a permanent feature of the Ptolemaic religious landscape, in ways that his successors maintained for generations. The specific character of the Philadelphus epithet, brother Louver, which was Ptolemy II's defining title, was connected specifically to his relationship with Arsinoe. The title expressed not simply a dynastic arrangement, but the specific quality that the royal court and then the wider world associated with his reign. The capacity for loyalty, for sustained commitment, for the kind of love that maintained its intensity even in the extraordinary pressures of Hellenistic royal life. Whether this reputation was fully deserved is a question that the ancient sources do not allow to resolve cleanly. What it tells us is how Ptolemy II wanted to be remembered, and what the specific cultural community he built understood as the characteristic quality of his reign. Not the military conqueror, not the administrative innovator, the brother lover, the man who built the library and the pharos and the greatest city in the world, and who loved his sister enough to make her a goddess when she died. That specific combination, the builder and the lover, the intellectual patron and the man of genuine personal attachment, is the full picture of Ptolemy II Philadelphus. It is a picture that the silence of popular history has obscured. It is time for it to be seen clearly. Chapter 8. The Great Procession and what it said in approximately 270 BC. The specific date is uncertain, but the event is associated with the early to middle years of Ptolemy II's reign. Alexandria staged what the ancient sources describe as the most extraordinary public spectacle in the history of the Hellenistic world. The pomp, the great procession in honor of Dionysus, was not simply a parade. It was a stage demonstration of the full scope of Ptolemaic power and Ptolemaic reach, organized with the theatrical intelligence of a ruler who understood that public display was itself a form of political communication. The account of the procession preserved by Athenaeus, drawing on the eyewitness description of Calixinus of Rhodes, runs to several pages in modern editions and describes an event of extraordinary scale and extraordinary variety. The procession included floats, decorated wheeled platforms, depicting scenes from mythology, including a reconstruction of the cave of Dionysus, a moving statue of the god that dispensed wine from a mechanism hidden inside it, and elaborate representations of the mythological geography of Dionysus's world. It included hundreds of performers in costume, representing the various followers and associates of the god in the mythological tradition. It included military units in full equipment, a display of the Ptolemaic army in its organized military capacity, and units of foreign soldiers in their distinctive national dress from across the territories that the Ptolemaic commercial networks reached. But the most striking elements, by the surviving account, were the animals. The exotic animals of Ptolemy II's collection were paraded before the population of Alexandria and the foreign observers who had gathered for the occasion. The elephants, the ostriches, the bears, the exotic birds in their cages, the enormous python carried by handlers, they were the living evidence of the commercial geography of Ptolemaic power, proof that the king's reach extended to the places these animals came from. that the commercial networks his father had established, and he had extended, had actually produced these extraordinary creatures from the ends of the earth. The scale of the public consumption was equally spectacular. The ancient account gives figures for the quantities of wine and other goods distributed to the population during the festival that, even allowing for ancient numerical exaggeration, imply a consumption event of extraordinary magnitude. The distribution of wine was itself a political act, a demonstration that the king's resources were sufficient not just to sustain the state, but to be shared with the population on a scale that no private individual or private institution could match. The pomp was, in the fullest sense, Alexandria performing itself for its own population and for the world. It said, "We are here, we have these resources, we reach this far, we have built this city. Come and see what the most extraordinary civilization in the world looks like when it decides to show you." The specific choice of Dionysus as the divine focus of the procession was not arbitrary. Dionysus was the god of wine, of transformation, of the journey beyond the known world. The god who, in the mythological tradition, had travelled further than any other Olympian, reaching India in his legendary progress across the known world. He was also the god with whom Alexander the Great had identified himself on his campaigns, the divine precedent for the conqueror who went beyond the boundaries of the civilized world. And he was a god with Egyptian equivalents. The associations between Dionysus and Osiris, the Egyptian god of death and resurrection, had been noted by Greek observers since at least the 5th century BC, and the Ptolemaic synthesis of Greek and Egyptian religious traditions found in the Dionysus-Osiris connection one of its most productive areas of synthesis. By staging a procession in honor of Dionysus, Ptolemy II was drawing on all of these associations simultaneously. The commercial reach to India, the connection to Alexander's legacy, the Greek-Egyptian religious synthesis. The procession was a single, staged event, but it spoke in multiple registers to multiple audiences, addressing each of them in the specific language that was most effective. This is the specific character of Ptolemaic cultural politics at its most sophisticated. Not a single message delivered uniformly to a uniform audience. Multiple messages delivered simultaneously to multiple audiences, each one resonating in the specific cultural register of its intended recipients. The Greek population saw a celebration of their god, a display of royal wealth and commercial reach, a festival of the kind that the great cities of the Greek world had always held. The Egyptian population saw their ruler performing the sacred role of the pharaoh, maintaining the divine order through the proper honoring of the god. The foreign observers, merchants, ambassadors, travelers, saw the most powerful ruler in the Mediterranean world displaying his power in the most complex and the most spectacular way available to a civilization at the peak of its ambition. Ptolemy II understood his audience. He understood all of his audiences, simultaneously and in their specific particularity. That understanding is the deepest expression of the governing intelligence that built the library and the pharos and the commercial empire and the great procession all at once. The rain did not fall on Ptolemy II's parade. The city was extraordinary. The light was burning in the harbour. The books were accumulating in the library. The scholars were arguing in the museum. The merchants were trading in the harbour. The priests were performing the rituals in the temples. Everything was working. For 38 years, everything was working. That is the achievement. That is the story. That is why the builder of Alexandria's wonders deserves the recognition that 2,000 years of subsequent history has largely withheld. Chapter 9. The Revenue Laws and Their Discovery in 1894 CE. The British papyrologists Bernard Grenfell and Arthur Hunt were excavating at the site of ancient Oxyrhynchus, a town in Middle Egypt whose rubbish heaps had already yielded an extraordinary quantity of papyri, making it one of the most important archaeological sites in the history of ancient documentary evidence. What they found that year, among the thousands of fragments they were sorting and photographing, was something that neither of them had expected to find: a large fragment of a comprehensive administrative document from the reign of Ptolemy II. The document was the revenue laws of Ptolemy Philadelphus, a systematic regulatory code governing the Ptolemaic oil monopoly and several related aspects of the kingdom's commercial life. It was the most comprehensive ancient regulatory document outside of Roman law that had survived from the ancient world, and its content was so unexpected in its sophistication that Grenfell, when he first read it, reportedly needed to sit down. The revenue laws prescribed in detail how the oil monopoly was to be administered across the entire kingdom, the specific percentages of land to be planted with oil-producing crops, the prices at which oil was to be sold to the population, the quality standards that producers had to meet, the penalty structure for violations of the regulations, the specific procedures for licensing oil merchants and monitoring their activities, and the administrative mechanisms for reporting and record-keeping that the system required. It was a comprehensive regulatory framework of a sophistication that Grenfell's generation of scholars had not expected from the ancient world. When Grenfell and Hunt published their edition of the revenue laws in 1896 CE, it transformed the scholarly understanding of the Ptolemaic state. Here was direct evidence, not the accounts of ancient historians who had their own agendas, not the hints in literary sources, but actual regulatory text that the Ptolemaic state had been operating with an administrative sophistication that anticipated, in specific and recognizable ways, the regulatory frameworks of modern commercial states. The implications reached beyond Egyptology and papyrology. The revenue laws demonstrated that the early Ptolemaic period, generally known as the era of Alexander's successors, associated in popular imagination with military campaigns and dynastic politics, had also been an era of remarkable administrative innovation in which the management of a complex commercial economy through systematic regulatory frameworks was being developed in ways that had no real precedent in the ancient world. Ptolemy II did not write the revenue laws personally. Administrative codes are the products of administrative communities, not of individual rulers. But the revenue laws bear his name, and the administrative system they describe was his administrative system, built during his reign, reflecting his priorities and his understanding of what governing a complex commercial state required. The document in Grenfell's hands, found in the rubbish heaps of an Egyptian town, was a fragment of the most sophisticated administrative mind of the ancient world. The rubbish heap had kept it for 2,000 years. The papyrologist who found it gave it back to history. That, too, is a form of the transmission that Ptolemy II had built at the library. The specific act of preserving what matters carefully in whatever medium and wherever circumstances allowed. The library transmitted the texts of the Greek literary tradition. The rubbish heaps of Oxyrhynchus transmitted the administrative reality of the Ptolemaic state. Together, they constitute the evidence for one of the most consequential reigns in the history of the ancient world, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, the builder of Alexandria's wonders, the patron of its scholars, the architect of its commercial empire, the man who made the most extraordinary city in the ancient world into what it was. And now, through the papyri, through the remains of the Pharos, through the books that bear the marks of the Alexandrian textual tradition, through the Septuagint that shaped 2,000 years of religious history, still visible, the Library of Alexandria burned, not in the single, catastrophic, civilizationally ending fire that the popular imagination tends to picture, the ancient equivalent of hitting delete on all human knowledge, but slowly, across several centuries, through a combination of gradual neglect, funding reduction, physical damage, and the slow dissolution of the institutional conditions that had made it function. The fire that Julius Caesar accidentally started in the harbour in 48 BC destroyed a significant portion of the storage facilities near the harbour, possibly a warehouse containing copies of books waiting to be distributed, or possibly part of the library's peripheral collection. It did not destroy the library itself, which was located in the Royal Palace district away from the harbour. The library continued to exist and function for centuries after Caesar's fire. What eventually ended the library was not fire, but time, the slow erosion of the specific conditions that had made it extraordinary. The later Ptolemaic rulers, consumed by the dynastic conflicts and military crises that characterized the 2nd and 1st centuries BC, had less interest and fewer resources for scholarly patronage. The Roman period brought new priorities and new cultural frameworks that were less hospitable to the specific character of the Alexandrian intellectual project. The Christian period brought new theological priorities that were in tension with the pagan scholarly traditions the library had maintained. By the time the Arab conquest of Egypt occurred in 641 CE, the library as an institution of the scope and ambition that Ptolemy II had built had long since ceased to exist. But this is the deeper truth. The library's most important work was already done by the time it began to decline. The canonical texts had been established, the Septuagint had been produced, Euclid's Elements had been written, Eratosthenes had measured the earth, Apollonius had written the Argonautica, Callimachus had produced the Pinaceis, Aristarchus had proposed heliocentrism. All of these achievements had been embedded in the scholarly tradition, had been copied, distributed, quoted, cited, and built upon in ways that made their content transmissible independent of the specific institution where they had been produced. Let that sink in. The library's decline did not erase what the library had done. It erased the institution. The work had already escaped into the world, embedded in the scholarly tradition, in ways that the burning of any single building or the decline of any single institution could not reach. The library transmitted its most important contents before it fell. The chain of transmission continued without it. This is the deeper truth about the Ptolemaic civilizational project that Ptolemy II most fully realized. Its most important investments were in transmission rather than in storage. The specific combination of patronage and publication and scholarly community that the library and museum represented was a system for getting knowledge into circulation, into the hands of scholars who would copy it, comment on it, build on it, and pass it to the next generation, rather than simply a system for gathering and preserving it in a single location. The storage aspect of the library is the aspect that captures the popular imagination. The image of all those books rolls on all those shelves, the image of everything that was there and is now lost. The transmission aspect is the aspect that actually mattered and that actually worked. The circulation of knowledge through the scholarly community of the ancient world that the library had created and sustained. Ptolemy II understood the difference. He was not simply building a museum of texts. He was building the most active and the most comprehensive knowledge production and knowledge transmission system in the history of the ancient world. And the test of whether it worked is not whether the building is still standing. It is not. But whether the knowledge elite produced and transmitted is still shaping the world. It is. The mathematics, the astronomy, the literary traditions, the scriptural translation, the administrative systems, the commercial networks. All of this reached subsequent generations because the library and the museum worked as transmission mechanisms rather than simply as storage facilities. The work escaped the building. The building eventually fell. The work kept running. There is another dimension of the deeper truth that this section must address, and it is the dimension that connects the story of Ptolemy II most directly to the previous accounts in this series. This series began with Psamtik I, restoring Egyptian sovereignty from Assyrian occupation through patience and strategic intelligence. It followed the arc of the late period, through Necho's commercial ambitions, through Amasus's brilliant synthesis, through Nectanebo's sustained building, through the catastrophe of the Second Persian conquest, and then turned to the Ptolemaic period with Ptolemy I's founding vision. Now, with Ptolemy II, it reaches the specific moment when the synthesis that the entire Ptolemaic project had been building toward was most completely realized. The synthesis. Greek intellectual ambition meeting Egyptian institutional depth, each transforming the other in the encounter, reached its fullest expression in Alexandria under Ptolemy II. The library was the most visible expression of this synthesis, but it was not the only one. The administrative system was a synthesis. Greek organizational intelligence applied to the deep institutional knowledge of the Egyptian administrative tradition. The commercial system was a synthesis. Greek maritime networks extended through the specific geographic position and the specific institutional capacity that Egypt's position at the junction of the Mediterranean and the Red Sea made possible. The religious system was a synthesis: the Serapis cult, the royal cult of the deified Arsinoe, the ongoing maintenance of the Egyptian temple establishments, alongside the Greek civic religious institutions. Each of these syntheses was genuinely productive, not simply a compromise between conflicting traditions, but a creation that was greater than either tradition taken separately. Euclid's Elements was not simply Greek mathematics. It was Greek mathematics shaped by the specific institutional conditions of Alexandria, which included the Egyptian tradition of practical mathematics applied to land, measurement, and architectural design. The Septuagint was not simply a translation. It was a new text, a Greek text with a specific theological and linguistic character, shaped by the encounter between Greek philosophical categories and Hebrew scriptural tradition, producing something that neither tradition alone could have produced. The deeper truth about Ptolemy II's reign is the truth about what happens when great traditions meet in the right conditions. Not the conditions of conquest, where one tradition is imposed on another. Not the conditions of parallel existence, where two traditions occupy the same territory without genuine engagement, but the conditions of synthesis, the specific institutional environment that the Ptolemaic state at its best created, in which different traditions were in genuine dialogue, in which the encounter was productive rather than merely coexistent, in which what emerged from the encounter was genuinely new rather than simply a combination of what had existed before. Those conditions were created by a specific ruler in a specific place at a specific moment. The ruler was Ptolemy II Philadelphus. The place was Alexandria. The moment was the early 3rd century BC, and the product of those conditions shaped the development of human civilization for the next 2,000 years. This is not hyperbole. It is the careful assessment of scholars who have spent careers tracing the specific intellectual and cultural genealogies that lead back to the Ptolemaic period. The chain of transmission is real and traceable. The library produced the canonical texts. The canonical texts shaped the intellectual tradition. The intellectual tradition shaped the subsequent development of philosophy, science, religion, and literature in the ancient and medieval worlds. And through those developments, the Ptolemaic civilizational project, the specific synthesis that Ptolemy II most fully realized, reached the modern world. We are among the specific, traceable heirs of what he built. Let that sink in one more time. The canonical texts of Western civilization, the texts that have been read, interpreted, and built upon across 2,000 years of Western intellectual history, were established in their specific forms by the scholars working in the library that Ptolemy II developed to its greatest scope and ambition. The mathematical tradition that eventually produced modern science was established in its foundational forms by the scholars working in the institution that his patronage sustained. The scriptural translation that shaped the theological tradition of Western Christianity was produced in his city under his patronage. He is invisible in popular history. He is ubiquitous in the history of ideas. The deeper truth is that the most consequential builders are rarely the most celebrated. The most visible monuments are the military ones, the campaigns, the battles, the conquests. The most durable monuments are the intellectual ones, the texts, the institutions, the specific knowledge that gets transmitted from generation to generation. Ptolemy II built the most important intellectual monuments in the history of the ancient world. They have outlasted everything else. The builder of Alexandria's wonders deserves to be known. The wonders are still with us. There is a grief in the story of Ptolemy II that is different from the grief in the stories of the native Egyptian pharaohs who preceded the Ptolemaic period. The grief of Psamtik, of Nekano, of Amasis, of Nectanebo, was the grief of civilizations trying to maintain themselves against forces that eventually proved too large, the grief of genuine endings, of the irreversible closing, of chapters that the people who lived through them understood as catastrophic losses. The grief in Ptolemy II's story is different. It is not the grief of an ending, but the grief of a potential that was only partially realized. The grief of what the library could have been, if it had been sustained, of what the synthesis could have produced if the conditions for the synthesis had been maintained, of what Alexandria could have become if the specific combination of resources and talent and vision and institutional health that Ptolemy II assembled had been replicated in the subsequent generations rather than gradually dissipating. The later Ptolemaic dynasty, the rulers who succeeded Ptolemy III Euergetes, who himself maintained much of his predecessor's vision, was by the scholarly consensus a long story of progressive decline. Not decline in the sense that Egypt's agricultural productivity collapsed, or that Alexandria ceased to be an important commercial city, but decline in the specific sense of the civilizational vitality that Ptolemy II had created. The decline of the scholarly patronage, the decline of the diplomatic reach, the decline of the specific administrative intelligence that had made the early Ptolemaic state extraordinary. The later Ptolemies fought each other, they murdered each other, they depleted the treasury in military adventures that produced diminishing returns. They allowed the institutional health of the state to deteriorate in ways that the administrative sophistication of the founding generation had maintained. This is the grief, not what was lost in any single catastrophe, but what was gradually allowed to dissipate from the inside out. What the founding generation had built with extraordinary care and sustained intelligence, and what the succeeding generations failed to maintain with equivalent care. The library did not need a fire to end it. It needed what every institution needs to survive: the sustained commitment of the people who governed it and funded it to understand its value and maintain the conditions that made it function. That sustained commitment was present in the founding generation and was gradually withdrawn by the subsequent ones. Let that sink in. The most consequential intellectual institution in the history of the ancient world was not destroyed by an external catastrophe. It was allowed to decline by the gradual withdrawal of the specific attention and the specific resources that it required to function at its highest level. The fire is the story that history prefers. The neglect is the actual story. And the neglect is more instructive for the present, because neglect is something that institutions can die of in any era. This is not science fiction. This is what the scholarly consensus says when the evidence is read without the dramatic narrative that popular history prefers. The library died slowly, of neglect, and of the gradual erosion of the institutional conditions that had made it extraordinary. And the specific moment at which that decline began was the moment after Ptolemy II, the moment when the founding vision passed to rulers who had inherited the institution without fully understanding what it was or what it required. The grief is also personal, in the specific sense that Ptolemy II himself understood. He was a man who built for permanence the library, the pharos, the commercial networks, the administrative systems, and who watched his closest companion die in the middle of his reign, transforming the specific personal relationship that gave him his title from a living reality into a cult, a deified presence, a series of images in temples across the kingdom. The brother-lover who loved his sister and then loved her memory, and then built that memory into the permanent fabric of the civilization he was creating. He died in 246 BC. At an age of somewhere between 60 and 70 after 38 years of rule. He died in his kingdom, having outlasted the threats of his early reign, and having built what he set out to build. He did not die in battle or in exile. He died in his palace, in the city he had made extraordinary. His son Ptolemy III Euergetes succeeded him and demonstrated, in the early years of his reign, that the founding vision was not completely lost. Euergetes was himself a capable ruler and a genuine intellectual patron, and the library continued to function at a high level under his rule. The decline was not immediate, but the specific combination of qualities that had made Ptolemy II's reign the high point of the dynasty was not replicated, and the dynasty's trajectory from the mid-3rd century BC onward was, with occasional exceptions, downward. This trajectory was not inevitable. It was the product of specific choices made by specific people. Different choices might have produced different outcomes. The civilization that Ptolemy II built was not inherently fragile. It was the product of a genuinely deep institutional foundation, What it required to continue was the sustained engagement of people who understood its value and were committed to maintaining it. The sustained engagement was not sustained, and the civilization that might have continued to develop, that might have produced further centuries of intellectual achievement, of commercial vitality, of the specific synthesis that was its most remarkable feature, did not continue at the level it had reached under Ptolemy II. The grief of the library is not the grief of the fire. It is the grief of the gradual withdrawal of attention, the specific, quiet, unremarkable failure to maintain what someone extraordinary had built. It is the grief of every institution that has ever been neglected by people who did not understand what they had. But the deeper truth is this: what was transmitted was enough. Not everything that might have been produced was produced. Not every potential of the synthesis was realized. But what was realized, the canonical texts, the Septuagint, the elements, the measurement of the earth, the pinakes, the commercial and administrative systems, was sufficient to shape the subsequent development of human civilization in ways that are still ongoing. The transmission was enough. The work survived. And the builder who made the transmission possible, who created the conditions within which all of this could happen, who sustained those conditions for 38 years, with the intelligence and the patience and the genuine commitment that the project required, deserves to be recognized for what he did. The wonders are still with us. The books are still being read. The measurements are still essentially correct. The translation still shapes the liturgy of millions of people. The administrative frameworks he pioneered still influence the way complex states manage their commercial activities. The light in the harbour has gone out. The Pharisees' rubble on the floor of the harbour of Alexandria, but the ships still come. The harbour is still one of the most important ports in the Eastern Mediterranean. Alexandria endures. The civilization he built transmitted itself into everything that followed, and Ptolemy II Philadelphus, the builder of its wonders, deserves to be remembered for what he actually was: one of the most consequential civilizational builders in the history of the ancient world. There is one final dimension of the deeper truth that this section requires, and it is the dimension that connects the story of Ptolemy II most directly to the story of the Egyptian civilization that his dynasty had inherited, and that the entire series of accounts has been tracing: the specific character of the Ptolemaic synthesis. The specific combination of Greek intellectual ambition and Egyptian institutional depth that Alexandria represented was not simply a Macedonian imposition on an Egyptian substrate. It was a genuine encounter, and the Egyptian component contributed to the synthesis in ways that the Greek literary tradition, which is the primary surviving evidence, tends to underrepresent. The Egyptian mathematical tradition, 3,000 years of practical mathematics applied to land measurement, to architectural design, to the management of the agricultural calendar, contributed specific techniques and specific problem-solving approaches to the mathematical culture of Alexandria that were absorbed, without always being explicitly acknowledged, into the Greek mathematical tradition that Euclid synthesized. The Egyptian astronomical tradition, centuries of systematic sky observation maintained by the temple establishments, contributed observational data and specific astronomical records to the Alexandrian astronomical tradition that produced Eratosthenes and Aristarchus. The Egyptian administrative tradition, the 3,000-year institutional knowledge of how to manage a complex agricultural economy through a systematic bureaucratic apparatus, contributed the foundational knowledge on which the Ptolemaic administrative innovations were built. These Egyptian contributions to the Ptolemaic synthesis are not always visible in the surviving literary evidence, because the surviving evidence was produced primarily in Greek and was transmitted primarily through the Greek scholarly tradition. But they are real, and they are significant, and the specific character of what the Ptolemaic synthesis produced was shaped by them in ways that make the entire project genuinely bicultural, rather than simply the application of Greek intellectual methods to an Egyptian raw material. Ptolemy II built this synthesis more completely than any of his predecessors or successors. He did it in a city founded by a Macedonian conqueror on the coast of the most ancient civilization on Earth, with resources generated by 3,000 years of Egyptian agricultural management, organized by an administrative system that drew on both Greek organizational intelligence and Egyptian institutional depth, expressed in the most ambitious cultural project in the history of the ancient world. The project transformed the ancient world. It is still transforming ours. That is the deepest truth, and it deserves to be known. The silence around Ptolemy II in popular historical consciousness is the specific silence around the builder who made the specific contributions that shaped everything most directly. His father, the general, is more narratively compelling. The campaigns, the theft of Alexander's body, the wars of the Diadochi. His last descendant, Cleopatra, is more dramatically compelling. The relationship with Caesar and Antony, the fall of the dynasty, the asp and the death. But neither of them produced what Ptolemy II produced. Neither of them built the library in its greatest period, the Pharos, the commercial empire reaching to India, the synthesis that made Alexandria the intellectual center of the world. The builder stands between the general and the queen. He is the reign that did the deepest work. He is the ruler whose decisions most profoundly shaped the intellectual inheritance that the subsequent world received from the Ptolemaic civilization. And he is the ruler who is most systematically overlooked. This account has been working to correct that oversight. The following sections complete the correction. He built the wonders. The wonders shape the world. The world is still shaped by them. And the man who built them has been standing in the shadows of the general who preceded him, and the queen who concluded the dynasty he founded. The shadows are lifting. The builder is becoming visible. That visibility, the recognition of what Ptolemy II actually built and what it actually means for the world that received it, is what the remaining sections of this account are designed to establish and to celebrate, because celebration is the right word. The Library of Alexandria at its greatest, the Pharos burning in the harbour, Callimachus arguing with Apollonius in the museum courtyard, Eratosthenes measuring the earth with shadows, the Septuagint taking shape in the workshops of the scholars, the merchant ships from India unloading their spice cargo at the Red Sea ports, the great procession moving through the streets of Alexandria, all of this happening simultaneously, in the same generation, in the same city, under the patronage of the same extraordinary ruler. This is worth celebrating. This deserves to be seen and recognized and understood. The following sections complete the account, the celebration, and then the close. Step back from the specific story of Ptolemy II and look at the broader pattern. The series of accounts that this collection has produced, from Psamtik I to Ptolemy II, from the 7th century BC to the 3rd, from the restoration of native Egyptian sovereignty to the founding of the last dynasty, and its greatest realization, has been, at its deepest level, a series of accounts about the relationship between builders and history. The builders are consistently the least remembered figures in the history they built. Psamtik I, who restored Egyptian independence through patience and strategic intelligence, is almost unknown outside specialist scholarship. Necho II, who ordered the first circumnavigation of Africa and began the Suez Canal, is remembered in popular history primarily for a battle he won and a battle he lost. Amasis, whose 44-year reign was the commercial and cultural peak of the Sete dynasty, is a footnote in most accounts of the ancient world. Nectanebo II, who built more temples than any ruler since the New Kingdom and managed the last genuine expression of native Egyptian pharaonic tradition, is known primarily for a legend that is not historically accurate. Ptolemy I, who founded the most durable of the Diadochi kingdoms and laid the foundations for the library, is overshadowed by the conqueror he served. And now Ptolemy II, who completed the library, built the Pharos, produced the Septuagint, and created the intellectual and commercial center of the ancient world. He is overshadowed by his father and by his final descendant. The pattern is consistent. The builders are consistently displaced by the conquerors and the destroyers, by the figures whose activities generated the kind of dramatic narrative that ancient historiography preferred to record, and that popular history has always found more compelling than the quieter, more sustained, less visually dramatic work of building. The implication is not that the conquerors are not important, they are. The campaigns of Alexander created the specific conditions within which the Ptolemaic civilizational project became possible. Without the conquest, there would have been no opportunity for the synthesis. The military achievements that ancient historiography preferred to record were the necessary preconditions for many of the building achievements that created the most durable results. But the necessary precondition is not the same as the accomplishment. Alexander's conquest was the precondition. Ptolemy II's library was the accomplishment. And in the specific long-term contest between the precondition and the accomplishment, in the specific question of which of the two has more profoundly shaped the world we inhabit, the library wins. The conquest ended. The knowledge it produced keeps running. This is the implication that the story of Ptolemy II most urgently presses on the present. Not a prescription for how to govern or how to build. The past does not supply operating instructions for the present, but evidence, specific and traceable, for a proposition that popular history tends to underweigh, that the most consequential investments are in knowledge and in the institutions that produce and transmit knowledge, rather than in military campaigns or in physical monuments, however impressive. The library was both more expensive and more consequential than the pharos. The pharos is the wonder that captures the imagination. The library is the wonder that changed the world, and Ptolemy II understood the difference, invested in both, and built the combination that made Alexandria irreplaceable. The second implication is about synthesis, about what happens when genuinely different traditions meet in conditions that support genuine engagement, rather than simple coexistence or simple dominance. The Greek-Egyptian synthesis that the Ptolemaic state at its best represented was not a fusion, not the erasure of difference in the production of something homogeneous. It was a synthesis in the more precise sense, the encounter of different traditions that preserved the distinctiveness of each while producing, in the encounter, something that neither tradition could have produced alone. Euclid's Elements could only have been written in Alexandria, at the specific intersection of the Greek mathematical tradition and the Egyptian practical mathematical tradition within the specific institutional context that the library provided. The Septuagint could only have been produced in Alexandria at the specific intersection of the Greek philosophical vocabulary and the Hebrew scriptural tradition within the specific institutional context of a Ptolemaic state committed to both the Greek scholarly project and the accommodation of its Jewish community. The specific conditions for this kind of productive synthesis are not easy to create and are not common. They require a specific combination of institutional investment, cultural openness, political stability, and the specific personal qualities of the people who govern the conditions. The ability to hold different traditions in productive tension, rather than collapsing the tension by asserting the dominance of one over the other. Ptolemy II held the tension. For 38 years, he maintained the specific conditions that made the synthesis productive, rather than simply coexistent. He maintained them with the intelligence and the patience that they required, and the results defined the intellectual culture of the ancient world for the next 5 centuries. The third implication is about scale, about what it means to think at the scale of civilizational impact rather than at the scale of individual ambition. Ptolemy II was not a modest man. He staged the most extraordinary public spectacle in the ancient world. He built the tallest artificial structure since the pyramids. He established the most ambitious knowledge institution in human history. His ambition was enormous, but it was an ambition that was consistently directed outward, toward the civilization he was building, toward the world he was engaging with, toward the specific project of making Alexandria something that would outlast him, rather than inward toward his own personal glorification. This outward direction of ambition is what distinguishes builders from conquerors. Alexander's ambition was directed inward, toward the expansion of his own power, his own territory, his own divine status. The empire he built was an expression of his personal greatness, and it depended on his personal greatness for its coherence. When he died, the empire died because the empire was him. Ptolemy II's ambition was directed towards something that existed independently of his personal presence. The library existed independently of him. The scholarly community existed independently of him. The commercial networks existed independently of him. He had created the conditions for all of these things, but the things themselves, the institutions, the texts, the knowledge, the commercial relationships, had their own existence and their own momentum that did not depend on his personal continued presence. This is what it means to build at the scale of civilizational impact. You create something that generates its own momentum, something that continues after you are gone, that transmits itself forward, that produces consequences across timescales longer than any individual life. Ptolemy II built this. The library kept running after him. The texts kept being copied. The knowledge kept being transmitted. The commercial networks kept operating. That is the legacy. That is the implication. And that is why, when this series of accounts comes to its close in the following section, the name of Ptolemy II Philadelphus deserves to be spoken with the same recognition and the same respect that the more dramatically celebrated figures of the ancient world receive. He built more, he lasted longer, he mattered more. The silence ends here. The specific moment when this series of accounts should be understood as complete is the moment when the intellectual and civilizational arc it has been tracing becomes visible in its full scope. The arc began in 664 BC with Psamtik I, a Sete prince who had been educated at the Assyrian court and who came home to rebuild Egypt's sovereignty through a combination of patience, Greek mercenaries, priestly alliances, and the specific governing intelligence that distinguished him from every other actor in the chaotic post-Assyrian Near East. The arc proceeded through Necho II's outward ambitions, the canal, the circumnavigation, the fleet, and Amasis's brilliant synthesis of Egyptian tradition and Mediterranean cosmopolitanism, and Nectanebo II's sustained building right up to the moment when the Persian army finally broke through and the departure of the last native pharaoh into the desert south of Memphis. Then the arc bent, the native political form ended, the Persian decade came and went, brutal and disruptive. Alexander arrived and was welcomed as the son of Ammon. Ptolemy I took Egypt as his portion and built it into the most stable and the most intellectually ambitious of the successor kingdoms. And now Ptolemy II completed what his father had begun, realizing the specific civilizational vision of the Ptolemaic synthesis at its fullest and its most productive. The arc covers 5 centuries. It traces the story of one of the most ancient civilizations on Earth through its last native expressions and its first great synthesis with the post-Alexander Hellenistic world. It is a story about how civilizations survive and about how they transform when the specific political form that sustained them changes, while the institutional and cultural foundations that made them valuable persist. Egypt survived. The temples built by Nectanebo were maintained under Persian, and then Macedonian, and then Ptolemaic patronage. The priestly traditions were continued. The administrative knowledge was incorporated into the new administrative systems. The agricultural management systems kept the Nile Valley productive. The commercial connections that the Sete period had established with the Greek world kept functioning and were extended. The specific knowledge, mathematical, astronomical, medical, administrative, that 3,000 years of Egyptian civilization had accumulated was transmitted into the Hellenistic synthesis that Alexandria represented. Ptolemy II was the ruler under whom this transmission was most completely and most productively realized. The library was his vehicle. The synthesis was his achievement. The consequences are still running. The implications for how we think about the relationship between political forms and civilizational substance are clear and specific. Political forms end. Civilizational substance transmits. The pharaonic political form ended with Nectanebo's departure. The civilizational substance, the institutional traditions, the knowledge systems, the agricultural management, the cultural forms continued for centuries and contributed to the specific character of the Ptolemaic civilization that inherited and transformed them. The Ptolemaic political form would eventually end too, with Cleopatra's death in 30 BC and the incorporation of Egypt into the Roman Empire. But the civilizational substance continued. The commercial networks, the administrative systems, the intellectual tradition of Alexandria, the specific forms in which Greek and Egyptian religious and cultural life had been synthesized under Ptolemaic patronage. All of this was inherited by Rome and continued, in modified forms, through the Roman, Byzantine, and eventually Islamic periods. The chain of transmission that Ptolemy II built at the library is still the most visible thread of this continuity. It is the thread that most directly connects the ancient world to the modern, and it was built deliberately, intelligently, and with the full understanding of its significance by one of the most consequential builders in the history of the ancient world. His name was Ptolemy, his title was Philadelphus, his city was Alexandria, his library changed the world. Now you know why. The modern city of Alexandria is still one of the most important cities in the Mediterranean basin. It is still a commercial port of major significance. It is still, in certain quarters and certain communities and certain moments of encounter between different cultural traditions, something of what Ptolemy II made it. A place where different worlds meet. The specific character of that encounter has changed dramatically across 2,000 years of subsequent history. But the city is still there. The harbour is still there. The commercial geography that made the site exceptional is still there. The library is not there, not as a building, not as an institution continuous with the ancient one. The modern Bibliotheca Alexandrina, opened in 2002 CE on the waterfront of Alexandria, is a deliberate tribute to the ancient library rather than its continuation. It is a beautiful building, designed with the specific aspiration of honouring the memory of the ancient institution. But it is a tribute, not a resurrection. The ancient library is gone. What remains is the transmission. The books that bear the marks of the Alexandrian textual tradition, the specific forms in which the canonical texts of Western civilization were established by the scholars who worked in the library that Ptolemy II built. They are in every library in the world where those texts are held. They are in every university where those texts are taught. They are in the specific theological and philosophical vocabulary that 2,000 years of Western thought has used. The builder of Alexandria's wonders is in all of this, invisible but present, overlooked but consequential. The silence around him is the silence of history failing to attend to what it has received. That silence ends here. The Pharos no longer stands. 1,400 years after Ptolemy II had it completed. 1,400 years of continuous operation, of fire burning through the night to guide the ships of the most important commercial harbour in the ancient world. The last remnants of the lighthouse fell into the harbour of Alexandria in the series of earthquakes that struck the Egyptian coast in the 12th, 13th and 14th centuries CE. What remained of the structure after the earthquakes was incorporated into the Mamluk fortress of Kawit Bay, built on the same island in the 1480s CE, which still stands today. The underwater survey teams that have worked in the harbour of Alexandria since the 1990s CE have found the Pharos on the floor of the harbour, not the complete structure. The stones were scattered and the organic materials are long dissolved, but the large carved blocks that once formed its exterior face, now covered in marine growth, lying in the specific pattern of a building that fell rather than was dismantled. The blocks are identifiable from their size and their carving style. They are enormous, some of them several meters long and weighing many tons, evidence of the ambition of the original structure and of the force of the earthquakes that eventually brought it down. Archaeologists examining the blocks on the harbour floor have identified specific carved elements that allow tentative reconstruction of aspects of the Pharos's appearance. French underwater archaeologist Jean-Yves Emperor, who led the harbour surveys in the 1990s, described the experience of finding the Pharos blocks as one of the most extraordinary moments of his archaeological career. Not the drama of a tomb opening or a hidden chamber revealed, but the quieter, more profound experience of finding the specific physical remains of something that had shaped the imagination of the ancient world for more than 1,000 years. The blocks are still there. They will be there for a long time. Stone does not dissolve in salt water, and the harbour floor is not disturbed by the agricultural activities that destroy so many ancient sites on land. The Pharos, in its scattered and saltwater-covered form, is one of the most accessible ancient monuments in the world to future archaeologists who develop the ability to work on the harbour floor more comprehensively than current technology allows. Somewhere in the harbour of Alexandria, the light that burned for 1400 years is lying in pieces on the bottom, waiting. The answer to the title question, who was Ptolemy II Philadelphus, the builder of Alexandria's wonders, is now as complete as this account can make it. He was the son of Ptolemy I Soter, the Macedonian general who founded the Ptolemaic dynasty and established the founding vision of what Alexandria could become. He was born approximately in 309 BC and became co-regent with his father in 285 BC, succeeding to sole rule at his father's death in 282. He ruled for 38 years until his death in 246 BC. He married his sister Arsinoe II, deified her after her death, and bore through his entire subsequent reign the title Philadelphus, the brother lover, by which history knows him. He completed the Pharos lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, which burned continuously for 1400 years. He developed the Library of Alexandria to its greatest scope and its most ambitious realization, employing Xenodotus, Callimachus, and Apollonius of Rhodes among others, and creating the scholarly community within which Euclid wrote the Elements and Eratosthenes would later measure the earth. He organized or supported the production of the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures that shaped the theological development of Greek-speaking Judaism, early Christianity, and the entire subsequent Western religious tradition. He developed the Red Sea trade to a level of systematic commercial significance that reached from Egypt to India, establishing the commercial infrastructure that Rome would inherit and extend. He produced the revenue laws, one of the most sophisticated administrative documents in the history of the ancient world. He staged the Great Dionysian procession, the most extraordinary public spectacle in the ancient world, as a simultaneous celebration of commercial reach, royal power, and the cultural synthesis that Alexandria represented. He did all of this in 38 years, in one city, with the resources of the most productive agricultural territory in the ancient world, and the institutional inheritance of 3,000 years of Egyptian civilization. He was overshadowed by his father, the general, and by his final descendant, the queen. He deserved better than the shadow. The most important monuments are not the most visible ones. The lighthouse burned and fell. The library declined and was allowed to disintegrate. The commercial empire was inherited by Rome. The administrative systems were modified by every subsequent administration. All of the external forms changed and eventually vanished. What persisted is the transmission. The canonical texts of Greek literature, established by the Alexandrian scholars, are in every library in the world where those texts are held. The mathematical tradition inaugurated by Euclid's Elements, written in the library that Ptolemy II built, is in every mathematics textbook in the world. The Septuagint, produced in Alexandria under Ptolemaic patronage, shaped the theological tradition of Christianity in ways that are still ongoing in the liturgy of the Greek Orthodox Church and in the biblical scholarship of every subsequent Christian tradition. The commercial infrastructure of the Red Sea trade, built by the Ptolemaic state in the 3rd century BC, was inherited by Rome and continued to generate wealth for the most powerful empire in the ancient world for the next 5 centuries. The builder built things that outlasted the building. That is the measure of the achievement. And by that measure, Ptolemy II Philadelphus was one of the most consequential builders in the history of the ancient world. He is in the books. He is in the mathematics. He is in the harbour floor in Alexandria, in the scattered blocks of the Pharos that underwater archaeologists have found and photographed and catalogued. He is in the chain of transmission that runs from the Library of Alexandria through the scholarly traditions of the ancient and medieval and modern worlds to every person who has ever opened a book in the Western tradition. He is not in popular memory. He is in everything that popular memory has received without knowing its origin. The last wonder of Alexandria is not the lighthouse, it is the library. And the last wonder of the library is not the building is gone. The last wonder of the library is the chain of transmission it established, the books that the Alexandrian scholars edited and distributed, the mathematics that Euclid synthesized in its shadows, the translation that the Jewish scholars produced on the island of Pharos while the lighthouse burned above them. The knowledge that escaped the building before the building fell. The chain still runs. The knowledge still transmits. The wonders are not ruins. They are everything that the ancient world's most ambitious civilizational project managed to send forward to us. Think about what that means. A specific ruler in a specific city making specific decisions about which scholars to invite, which texts to collect, which translations to commission, which commercial routes to develop. Those specific decisions in the 3rd century BC shaped the specific intellectual inheritance that the modern world received. The chain of transmission from those decisions to the present is real and traceable. The books exist, the mathematics exists, the translation exists. The commercial infrastructure that Rome inherited and extended exists in the record of what Rome built on top of it. None of it was inevitable. Any of the specific decisions could have been made differently. A different patron could have invited different scholars, or funded different work, or failed to fund anything at all. A different administrative system could have failed to generate the revenue that supported the patronage. A different cultural vision could have produced a different kind of institution, a palace library for royal use rather than a scholarly community for the benefit of the world. Ptolemy II made the specific decisions that produced the specific results. He was the builder. He built the conditions. He sustained them for 38 years. And the transmission ran. It is still running now. It is still running now. His name was Ptolemy. His city was Alexandria. His library changed the world. And now you know it.